Xiaofan's Wuxia Tales. Chapter 5609. The powerful fist wind behind Kong Shinmu brought with it waves of pressure that enveloped Kong Shinmu's entire body. The explosive power caused Kong Shinmu to be unable to determine where the power was coming from. Facing Ao Tong's puppet, which was at the 8th layer, or even stronger, Kong Shinmu did not dare to relax his soul power. Even when using the dark steel power, he also released his soul power to determine Ao Tong's puppet's attack. Even so, Kong Shinmu's judgment of Ao Tong's puppet's attack was still a little slow. Kong Shinmu, in front. Mo Ya's gentle voice rang in Kong Shinmu's ears at the right time. Kong Shinmu did not have much time to think. He suddenly used the 33 layers dragon martial technique and slapped it forward. Almost at the instant Kong Shinmu made his move, a huge palm with a mysterious seal appeared in the void in front of him. Kong Shinmu's pitch-black divine dragon body carried the powerful 33 layers dragon martial technique. When it collided with the palm, it was unable to repel it. However, the huge energy produced by the collision of the two made Kong Shinmu's hand numb. No! Ao Tong's puppet's palm was not unharmed. A crack appeared in the giant puppet's palm from the impact of the powerful energy. Kong Shinmu wanted to take the opportunity to cut off Ao Tong's palm and use it as a breakthrough to defeat Ao Tong's puppet. However, Kong Shinmu's next palm attack missed. Could it be behind me? After fighting with Ao Tong's puppet for 2 rounds, Kong Shinmu had a rough understanding of Ao Tong's puppet's attack pattern. Either in front or behind. Kong Shinmu took a step to the side and used the power that he had already gathered to slap behind him. Kong Shinmu, above. Mo Ya's gentle voice carried a hint of anxiety. The moment Kong Shinmu received Mo Ya's message, Ao Tong's puppet's palm was already close to Kong Shinmu's head. A powerful suction force that seemed to want to tear his bones to shreds suddenly engulfed his entire body. Kong Shinmu couldn't dodge in time, so he could only use the power of the dark steel to resist it. Of course, even though he knew that he might not be able to defeat Ao Tong's puppet in a clash of strength, Kong Shinmu was not stupid enough to fight head-on. He first used the 33-fold dragon martial technique to take on Ao Tong's puppet's attack. At the moment when the powerful pressure came, he used his stiff body of the black divine dragon and the power of the dark steel to resist the powerful pressure that invaded his body. The energy that had been resisted penetrated the ground around Kong Shinmu and even the space around him. Kong Shinmu made use of the extremely short amount of spatial energy that came out when the space was distorted to offset the power of Ao Tong's puppet. At the same time, Kong Shinmu used the power of the soul to predict how Ao Tong's puppet would attack next. Ao Tong's puppet was relying on its own powerful strength to attack Kong Shinmu, and Kong Shinmu couldn't use the power of devouring. Otherwise, Kong Shinmu planned to use the power of devouring to devour Ao Tong's strength. To Jiang Shenwu, a supreme superior grade martial technique that possessed the 8th layer, or even higher, would be a rare cultivation tonic. Kong Shinmu and Ao Tong's puppet had only exchanged 3 blows, and Kong Shinmu was gradually at a disadvantage. On the other hand, Ao Tong's puppet only relied on its own strength to attack. As for its martial technique that was stronger than the 8th layer, it hadn't been used yet. Throughout the entire process, Mo Ya's beautiful eyes were fixed on Ao Tong's puppet. Every time Ao Tong's puppet attacked, there would seem to be a 5-colored line flashing through its body. That should be Ao Tong's 5 elements power. After abandoning its soul and becoming a puppet, the 5 elements power didn't disappear. Instead, it fused into the puppet's body. The 5-colored line was the proof that the 5 elements power still existed. However, as its body became a puppet, the 5 elements power and the attributes of the 5 elements also gathered together. Every time Ao Tong's puppet attacked with its palm, it looked like it was using its own strength, but in reality, it was using the 5 elements power. It was normal for Kang Shinmu to be unable to receive the five elements power that was stronger than the eighth layer. What surprised Emoya was that Jiang Shenwu was able to receive the puppet's power and neutralize it even though he didn't know the nature of Ao Tong's puppet's power. Kang Shinmu's comprehension was definitely superior. Emoya wasn't the only one who determined the nature of Ao Tong's puppet's attack. Shi Li, who was watching from afar, also made a judgment with her powerful soul. Ao Tong is rather hot-blooded. He would rather turn himself into a puppet than be controlled. Shi Li looked at the battlefield with interest. Facing the attack of the eighth layer of the five elements power, Kang Shinmu was actually able to withstand it. This was getting more and more interesting. There was also that Emoya. Shi Li glanced at Emoya, but she couldn't see her cultivation level. From the few words she said to warn Kang Shinmu, she could roughly determine that Emoya's supreme divine power was very strong. To be able to determine the movements of Ao Tong's puppet that had reached the eighth layer, Emoya's supreme divine power was most likely at the eighth layer, or even higher. Clan Elder, should we go? Someone from the Thousand-Winged Snake clan wanted to take advantage of the time when Kang Shinmu was being held back by Ao Tong's puppet to ambush Kang Shinmu and steal his treasure. There's no hurry. Shi Li glanced at the other clans who couldn't wait any longer. Her lips curled into a meaningful smile. It's right to kill and steal, but you need to know how to find the right time. After Shi Li's words, everyone from the Thousand-Winged Snake clan calmed down. There were many people watching the battle between Kang Shinmu and Ao Tong's puppet. Among them, the Talisman clan elder Shui Qinghan was killed by Kang Shinmu. The Demon God clan was even more miserable. First, Elder Ao Yu was killed. Then, Elder Ao Tong was forced to become a puppet with no consciousness. The three of them were supreme experts. They were experts that many cultivators dreamed of but couldn't reach. Today, they were being bullied by a brat. They were irreconcilable enemies with Kang Shinmu. If they didn't finish off Kang Shinmu, they wouldn't rest. The members of the Demon God clan and the Talisman clan suddenly rushed forward. Without saying anything, they directly attacked. The power of Jiang Shenwu's soul revolved around his body. Facing everyone's attacks, he had originally wanted to use the power of his divine flame to repel everyone who was in his way. However, he discovered that with his current cultivation and abilities, he could only use two supreme divine powers at the same time. Since he couldn't use the power of the divine flame, he decided to use the power of the mystical iron. After using the mystical iron power to repel a wave of cultivators, Kang Shinmu realized that there were more cultivators behind him. Although the mystical iron power was strong, it couldn't solve all the problems in one go. After thinking for a while, Kang Shinmu split a part of his soul power. The powerful soul power enveloped all the cultivators who came to attack Kang Shinmu. The cultivators who had gathered their hearts to fight against Kang Shinmu were controlled by Kang Shinmu's soul power. They lost their own consciousness and started to ignore everyone. The scene became chaotic. After dealing with these problems, Kang Shinmu sensed Ao Tong's puppet's palm attack. He felt it from all directions, including the top of his head. Where would it appear? Under his feet. Soon, Kang Shinmu determined where Ao Tong's puppet's palm attack was coming from. He moved to the side and saw Ao Tong's puppet's palm appear out of nowhere. Chapter 56:10. While Ao Tong's puppet was powerful, it took a long time to accumulate power. This also gave Kang Shinmu time to react. While Ao Tong's puppet took a long time to accumulate power, its movement speed was very fast. Don't look at how it was in front of him right now. It could appear behind him in the next moment, or in the sky, to the left, or in any direction. It could even return to its original position before it could react and catch the opponent off guard. Kang Shinmu did not dare to restrain his power of the soul in fear of making any mistakes. The problem now was that even if Ao Tong's puppet did not attack, Kang Xinmu did not dare to leave this place easily. He also could not guarantee when Ao Tong's puppet would suddenly appear and attack him. But continuing to waste time like this was not a solution. After its attack missed, Ao Tong's puppet disappeared and had not appeared until now. Kang Xinmu was thinking about how to use the power of profound iron to the greatest extent when he felt a slight change in the air flow around him. His many years of battle experience told him that Ao Tong's puppet's attack had already arrived. Compared to the previous attack, this time, Kang Xinmu judged that Ao Tong's puppet's attack would come from the front through the pressure in the air. He then gathered the power of the dark steel and sent out a palm strike. At the same time, Kang Xinmu's power of the soul suddenly felt the space behind him distort. Could it be that Ao Tong's puppet's attack would come from behind? No, the space above his head was also distorting slightly. Could it be that Ao Tong's puppet's attack would come from all directions? There was no time to think now. Kang Xinmu's pitch-black divine dragon body suddenly released the power of profound iron mixed with the power of the soul. Crack! Almost the moment Kang Xinmu released his power, the surrounding space gave off a series of sounds. Kang Xinmu clearly felt that his pitch-black divine dragon body was being suppressed by a powerful force from all directions. When the pitch-black divine dragon's body felt a strong pressure, the power of the mystic iron dispelled it and returned it. Kang Xinmu could clearly feel that Ao Tong's puppet's attacks were weaker than before. Perhaps it was because the power was too scattered, or perhaps it was because Ao Tong's puppet's palm was injured. With a loud bang, Ao Tong's huge body landed right in front of Kang Xinmu. Moya's slightly furrowed brows eased up slightly when she saw this scene, and she heaved a sigh of relief in her heart. From the start of this battle where there was a great disparity in strength until now, a rare faint smile had appeared on Moya's pretty face. Kang Xinmu's comprehension was indeed beyond that of ordinary cultivators. Even she herself had just figured out that Ao Tong's puppet would attack from all directions. However, Kang Xinmu had already come up with a countermeasure, which was enough to prove that Kang Xinmu had indeed grown a lot. However, Kang Xinmu could not defeat Ao Tong's puppet with pure strength. In the face of Kang Xinmu's attack, Ao Tong's puppet body showed no signs of breaking. Even his torn palm had recovered to its original state. It can actually recover from its injuries? How did a puppet without any soul or consciousness recover from its injuries? Kang Xinmu was still guessing that Ao Tong's puppet's power had weakened because of its palm injury, but unexpectedly, its palm injury had already recovered. Kang Xinmu, pay attention to the puppet's attack trajectory. Senior Moya's gentle voice rang in Kang Xinmu's ears. Although this puppet does not have supreme divine power, before it abandoned its consciousness, it turned the 5 elements' power into the 5 elements and stored them in its puppet body. In other words, the reason why he can recover from his injuries is because of the power of the 5 elements? Jiang Shenwu immediately guessed the abnormality of Ao Tong's puppet. Yes. Moya nodded. The puppet's own power is strong, but such a huge power is essentially also the 5 elements. Thank you for the reminder, Senior. After Moya's reminder, Kang Xinmu came to a sudden realization. Just now, he was indeed stuck in a dead end. He was only thinking about how to deal with the pressure from Ao Tong's puppet, and he neglected where the powerful pressure came from. The devouring power could not devour the puppet's own power, but it could devour the 5 elements. After the epiphany, Kang Xinmu released the devouring power again. In an instant, the earth-shattering devouring power surrounded Ao Tong's puppet and kept shrinking. At first, the devouring power could not penetrate into Ao Tong's puppet body. However, the palm of Ao Tong's puppet body was previously injured and was relatively weak. Jiang Shenwu's dark steel power once again broke through it, and the devouring power surged in from the injury. The moment the devouring power enveloped the 5 elements, it completely devoured them. Without the 5 elemental attributes, Ao Tong's puppet body began to sway. After devouring Ao Tong's 5 elements, Kang Xinmu vaguely felt that there was a weak connection between him and Ao Tong's puppet body. With this weak connection, Ao Tong's puppet no longer attacked Kang Xinmu. After Kang Xinmu completely devoured Ao Tong's 5 elements, Kang Xinmu could control Ao Tong's puppet. Oh no! Shi Li immediately sensed that something was wrong. His figure flashed and he suddenly disappeared. Kang Xinmu. While Moya was surprised that Kang Xinmu dared to keep Ao Tong's puppet for his own use, she also sensed Shi Li's movement. Be careful of the 1,000-winged snake clan, Moya anxiously reminded. Go! Kang Xinmu said in his heart. Ao Tong's huge body suddenly disappeared. When it reappeared, it was already standing behind Jiang Shenwu. At the same time, a snake's cry also appeared. However, Shi Li avoided Ao Tong's punch and retreated to a safe distance. Tsk tisk. Shi Li clicked her tongue. It is likely that old fellow Ao Tong never imagined that even at the moment of his death, he would still be a puppet controlled by you even after abandoning his consciousness and becoming a puppet. Since you and Ao Tong appreciate each other so much, why don't you accompany him? Kang Xinmu raised his brows and said faintly. As expected of someone with the black divine dragon body. His words are so firm. In terms of cultivation, Shi Li was not afraid of Kang Xinmu at all. However, Kang Xinmu controlled Ao Tong's puppet, so it would be troublesome to deal with him. That's all for today. You guys can leave. Shi Li glanced at Moya, then looked at Kang Xinmu and smiled. With that, he retreated to the 1,000-winged snake clan's group and ordered the entire clan to retreat. The other clans did not understand Shi Li's action, but after witnessing Kang Xinmu's terrifying strength, they also retreated. Senior Moya, let's go. Since Shi Li gave way, Kang Xinmu did not stand on ceremony and left with Moya. After flying for thousands of miles, Shi Li did not chase after them. Kang Xinmu finally believed that Shi Li really let them go. Kang Xinmu, your cultivation has improved a lot in this battle. Moya's beautiful eyes glanced at Ao Tong's puppet that followed closely behind Kang Xinmu. Chapter 56:11. Come to think of it, this puppet is really too big. Kang Xinmu looked at Ao Tong's puppet from head to toe and realized that it was actually traveling on foot. Because his strength was too great, every step he took would leave a hole in the ground. Along the way, the puppet had practically destroyed thousands of miles of land with just its feet. It did not matter if the ground was crushed, but these footprints undoubtedly left clues for the races that had conflicts with it. Kang Xinmu only wanted to leave earlier, so he did not think about Ao Tong's puppet. Now, he was ready to put it into his storage space. Senior Moya, I wonder why the storage space is unable to contain this puppet. Unexpectedly, after a while, the puppet was still in the same place. Kang Xinmu, your storage space can only contain living beings without any signs of life. Moya's beautiful eyes glanced at the huge puppet. This puppet has certain signs of life, so it cannot be contained. Is it because of the retention of the 5 elements? Kang Xinmu thought of a solution. The powerful puppet that could not be devoured by the devouring power was essentially supported by the 5 elements. Now that he thought about it, Ao Tong had abandoned his soul to become a puppet. In other words, he was a puppet without any signs of life. Then, who exactly was controlling the 5 elements? The only explanation was that the 5 elements had retained some of Ao Tong's soul and consciousness. Perhaps it was because this soul and consciousness was weak that it could not control the body. Yes. Moya nodded lightly and smiled gently. Therefore, you need a storage space Dharma artifact that can contain living beings. Senior Moya, do you know what kind of Dharma artifacts are like this? Jiang Shenwu didn't know much about those spatial storage artifacts, so he was completely baffled by them. Especially in this situation, where was he going to find a Dharma artifact that could contain this puppet? Yes, I know a Dharma artifact that is more suitable for you. Moya thought for a while and said gently. Senior Moya, please enlighten me. Kong Shinmu was delighted. It's called the Star Map Lock. Moya smiled lightly. Not only can the Star Atlas Lock contain living beings with life characteristics, but its space can even be used for cultivators to cultivate. Moya seemed to have thought of something and smiled mysteriously. Kong Shinmu, you will definitely be interested in the Star Atlas Lock. After listening to Senior Moya's simple introduction of the Star Atlas Lock, Kong Shinmu couldn't help but want to explore it. Throughout his cultivation journey, he had seen all kinds of spatial storage Dharma artifacts. He had also owned many treasure-level spatial magic tools. Unfortunately, some of them had been lost, while others had been destroyed in battle. In the Dragon Devil Cave, quite a few were destroyed. Senior Moya, do you know any clues about the Star Map Lock? Kong Shinmu looked at the giant puppet that was moving with them and felt a headache coming on. I don't know yet. Moya's pretty face was slightly apologetic, but her voice was still gentle. I only heard about it at an auction. I only saw the concept map. Sigh, Senior Moya, why don't we find a place to hide this puppet first? Kong Shinmu shrugged helplessly. Sure. Moya agreed with Kong Shinmu's suggestion. Although Ao Tong's puppet was very fast and powerful, it was too big. It would unknowingly expose Kong Shinmu's target, which was also a fatal hidden danger. 2 people and 1 puppet set off again. 4 hours later. Senior Moya, there are a lot of people quickly approaching. Kong Shinmu's soul power sensed that there were many cultivators in the surroundings. The moment he said that, he saw the puppet's huge body suddenly rush out. Bang! The air was filled with the sound of power clashing. Oh! Heart-devouring blood centipede? Vaguely, Kong Shinmu heard a surprised voice from not far away. Heart-devouring puppet? The first thing that came to Kong Shinmu's mind was Ao Tong's puppet. As a demon god race elder, he had abandoned his soul consciousness to become a puppet because he didn't want to become a puppet that he could order around. How did he become a heart-devouring blood puppet? Although the demon god race elder abandoned his soul consciousness to become a puppet, due to the 5 elements, the puppet has a certain degree of consciousness. Therefore, it can be considered a heart-devouring blood puppet, Moya said gently. In the end, Moya added, unfortunately, your puppet's judgment and attack consciousness is very weak. It's easily affected by external forces and will attack you instead. Yes. Jiang Shenwu finally understood that this demon god race elder had been turned into a heart-devouring blood centipede. It was no wonder that he couldn't store him in his storage space. The heart-devouring blood puppet, as the name suggested, was a puppet without any consciousness. Usually, the puppet was formed when a powerful cultivator used supreme divine power to refine it and turn it into a puppet. The heart-devouring blood centipede's physical strength and martial techniques far surpassed its original strength. Don't worry. The Star Map Lock can store this puppet. Moya seemed to see through Kong Shinmu's concerns and reminded him softly. Senior Moya, I'm not worried about that. Kong Shinmu coughed dryly. As he spoke, more forces began to gather in the surrounding space. By rough estimation, these unfamiliar powers were all supreme divine powers. Kong Shinmu could only distinguish the power of the divine fire and the power of the Holy Land. Other than that, there were supreme divine powers that he had never come into contact with before. There were many cultivators in the vast 1,000 worlds, and the path of cultivation was complicated. This was finally reflected at this moment. Kong Shinmu, try to see if you can summon the puppet back. Moya glanced at the surrounding space and said gently. Okay. Up until now, Kong Shinmu could only control Ao Tong's puppet through the power of the soul. Moreover, this was the first time he tried to summon the puppet back when it had left him. The result was, of course, failure. Senior Amoya, let's leave this place first. When he released the power of the soul earlier, Kong Shinmu sensed that something was wrong with the fluctuations in the surrounding space. Apart from the fluctuations caused by the battle between cultivators, there was something wrong with the space within a radius of 1,000 miles. It's too late. Suddenly, Amoya stopped in her tracks. Kong Shinmu, be careful. Don't split up. Then, Amoya approached Kong Shinmu and gently held onto Kong Shinmu with her slender hand. Kong Shinmu was stunned for a moment, but his power of the soul reminded him that this was not the time to be distracted. It was time to deal with the sudden changes. They did not expect that the space they were in was actually a mystic realm. Before they set off, there was indeed nothing unusual in the surroundings. But now, the power of the soul discovered that there were problems everywhere in this space. This was enough to prove that there was a spatial mystic realm that could move and come to this space. Chapter 56:12. Rumble. A loud noise suddenly resounded, and the surrounding space collapsed visibly. The strange thing was that the ground under their feet was not affected at all. Even the collapsing space did not affect the cultivators within a 1,000-mile radius at all. However, Kong Shinmu was keenly aware that many cultivators had disappeared into thin air. Senior Amoya, what is the power surrounding this space? Kong Shinmu looked around and roughly guessed that the space they were in was the entrance to the mysterious secret realm. At that moment, the entrance to the mysterious secret realm had already opened. The mysterious power in the arcane realm had brought many cultivators at the entrance into it. Kong Shinmu could not detect this power with his heart-soul power. It should be the rule power of this secret realm. Amoya narrowed her eyes slightly, suddenly opened her beautiful eyes, and said gently, "Rule power?" This was the first time Kong Shinmu had heard of this kind of power. Just by listening to the name, he could not tell anything. However, he was now a supreme-level cultivator after all, and he had a general understanding of the power that supreme-level cultivators could control. The core of supreme-level cultivators was supreme divine power. Supreme divine power was determined according to the cultivator's own talent power. There were 10 levels of strength, and each level was progressive. Other than a very few supreme-level powerhouses who had twin supreme divine power, ordinary supreme-level cultivators could only comprehend one type of supreme divine power. Of course, Kong Shinmu, who had the devouring power, was not counted among the regular supreme-level cultivators. He had never heard of the rule power. When Kong Shinmu was at the peak of Supreme God, he only regarded supreme-level or even supreme-level existences. However, when he truly stepped into the supreme stage, he realized that the supreme stage was only the beginning of cultivation. Even with the power that Kong Shinmu currently had, he could only vaguely figure out a little. As for what kind of level it was above supreme level, he still needed to work hard step by step. Presumably, the rule power that appeared now was a representative. He just did not know if his devouring power could devour the rule power. Yes, you will come into contact with the rule power. Amoya's tone was still gentle. Such an indifferent reaction caused Kong Shinmu to develop a different feeling towards Amoya. Kong Shinmu felt that Senior Moya was even more mysterious. From her supreme divine power to her current description of the power of rule. With the appearance of the power of rule in the mystic realm, many cultivators who were originally scattered gradually gathered together. With a cursory glance, Kong Shinmu had some impression of some of the cultivators' faces. Some of them had only met face to face, some of them had spoken to each other verbally. Of course, there were also those who had estranged each other and were even sworn enemies. While Kong Shinmu was sizing up the crowd was also sizing up Kong Shinmu. Those who had a grudge with Kang Xinmu even provoked Kang Xinmu and gestured at Kang Xinmu in disdain. In the face of these people's provocations, Kang Xinmu endured it. It wasn't that he suddenly had good intentions, but they had been brought into the mystic realm by the power of rule. It was best not to meet them in the mystic realm. There was one person who made Kang Xinmu's gaze stay on him for a moment longer. It was a young man dressed in a navy blue gown. The young man was tall and had handsome features. From the moment he appeared to the moment he was taken away by the power of rule, he always had a smile on his face as he gently fanned himself. It was completely different from the other cultivators who were taken away by the power of rule. The feeling the young man in the navy blue gown gave off was as if he knew the power of rule in this mystic realm. Moreover, Kang Xinmu couldn't see through his cultivation. His soul force couldn't sense the existence of the young man either. There was clearly a living person standing there, but when his soul force swept past, he couldn't sense anything. While Kang Xinmu was pondering, he glanced over and saw Mo Ya's beautiful eyes moving away from the young man in the navy blue gown. Immediately, he saw Mo Ya's delicate eyebrows slightly furrow. Someone who even senior Mo Ya paid attention to must have an extraordinary cultivation. What kind of mystic realm was this? How could it attract such an existence? Kang Xinmu, pay attention. Kang Xinmu was hesitant to ask Mo Ya if she knew that young man, but he heard Mo Ya's gentle voice. Yes. Senior too. Kang Xinmu responded. The two of them were surrounded by an invisible force. When their vision became clear again, the two of them were already in a new environment. The ground under their feet was full of sand, mixed with an ancient aura. As far as the eye could see, they were surrounded by a boundless sandy ground. There was no mountain range or palace, not even an abandoned palace. This dusty sandy ground seemed to cover this space, and even the sky above was filled with a rustic feeling. Senior Mo Ya, is this the mystic realm? Kang Xinmu only felt that this space was very stifling. It was as if there was an invisible force suppressing him, causing the power in his body to circulate somewhat sluggishly. Fortunately, he had the power of soul to protect his body, so he quickly adjusted his condition. Yes, we have entered the mystic realm. Mo Ya's beautiful eyes sized up the surrounding environment, and she said softly, let's go forward first, and see if we can find any useful clues. The two of them chose a direction and moved forward quickly. Along the way, they did not encounter any other cultivators, only the two of them. Of course, the two of them did not even encounter any fortuitous encounters similar to the mystic realm. After moving at high speed for a few hours, Mo Ya and Kang Xinmu discovered something strange one after the other. There was something wrong with this space. Kang Xinmu guessed that it was related to the power of rules in the mystic realm. He was about to try to use the power of devouring to devour the power of rules. In the blink of an eye, he saw a familiar figure. It was the young man in a navy blue robe from before. The young man walked on this sandy ground, as if he was taking a leisurely stroll. He seemed to have noticed Kang Xinmu and Mo Ya. He stopped in his tracks, and his long and narrow eyes glanced over. When the young man looked over, he did not speak immediately, but smiled slightly. It was unknown if he was smiling at Mo Ya, but in short, Kang Xinmu was very unhappy looking at him. The young man did not say much. He put away his folding fan, nodded slightly at them, and continued to move forward. After taking a few steps, he disappeared on the spot. Kang Xinmu's pupils shrank suddenly. This person must have some understanding of the power of rules. Also, who was he exactly? Was he someone that Senior Mo Ya knew? It was really difficult for Kang Xinmu to understand the young man from Mo Ya. Mo Ya's expression was always indifferent, and her tone was very gentle. It was hard to tell whether she was happy or angry. Even now, she still maintained her usual look. Kang Xinmu, your power of divine fire has reached the 7th level, right? Moya suddenly asked softly. Senior Moya, it should be the 6th level, Kang Shinmu corrected. Whether it's the 7th or the 6th level, you should be able to understand the scope of the Supreme Divine Force now. Chapter 56:13. Supreme God Power's Domain? Kang Shinmu seriously thought about the Supreme God Power Domain that Moya spoke of. Yes. Moya's beautiful eyes swept over Kang Shinmu and she smiled gently. A Supreme Cultivator can comprehend Supreme Divine Power. The Supreme Divine Power is determined by one's innate talent. After comprehending the Supreme Divine Power and cultivating to a certain realm, one will have a Supreme Domain. This is a power that exists opposite to the Supreme Divine Power. Supreme Domain is a very general concept. Generally speaking, Supreme Domain cultivators will release Supreme Divine Power during battle. When different Supreme God Power collide with each other, it will form a completely new power around the cultivator. This new power is essentially a power created by the cultivator to protect himself. In layman's terms, it is a power formed by the soul and consciousness. This is a domain. This domain is not a regular cultivator's domain. It is created by supreme cultivators and is inseparable from supreme God power. That is why it is called a supreme domain. At this point, Moya added, of course, the creation of a supreme domain requires an extremely strong soul and consciousness. That is why most supreme cultivators will gradually comprehend the supreme domain when their supreme God power reaches the 7th level. After obtaining 9 types of supreme God power in the blood mist, Kang Shinmu first chose to comprehend the power of God fire. Along the way, with the help of the devouring power and the soul power that he obtained by chance, Kang Shinmu's power of God fire had a qualitative breakthrough. Based on the strength he had displayed so far, he had reached the 6th level and felt like he was about to break through to the 7th level. The peak of the 6th level of power of God fire could completely control all fire-type powers in the world. The closer the power of God fire got to the 7th level, the more Kang Shinmu felt that his power of God fire could control all fire-type powers. With such strength, he didn't have any thoughts about the supreme domain. I am currently at the peak of the 6th level of power of God fire, but I feel confused. I have no clue about the supreme domain you mentioned. Kang Shinmu wasn't joking. Just now, Senior Moya had already made it very clear, but he really hadn't comprehended any supreme domain. The supreme domain is a general concept that needs to be comprehended slowly. Moya smiled gently. Don't be impatient. Yes. When it came to cultivation, regardless of whether it was comprehending a supreme domain or learning martial skills, one could not be impatient. Kang Shinmu was very clear about this. Kang Shinmu and Moya hadn't moved since the beginning. Moya's beautiful figure stood quietly at the side, a faint smile still hanging on her pretty face, even though the spatial environment here was so harsh. Moya and the environment of this space were like two extremes. One side was wreaking havoc, while the other was as calm as still water. Kang Shinmu was stunned for a moment. Suddenly, something seemed to flash through his mind. An idea occurred to him, and he withdrew the soul power that he had just released. After withdrawing the soul power, Kang Shinmu's supreme God power automatically withdrew itself. At this moment, he was like an ordinary person. He didn't have the aura of a cultivator on him at all. Kang Shinmu narrowed his eyes. His mind paused, and his consciousness entered his soul. At this moment, Moya, who had been standing quietly at the side, suddenly shifted her beautiful eyes to Kang Shinmu. Around Jiang Shenwu's body, there was a faint halo of light that was difficult to distinguish the color of. Gradually, the halo enveloped Kang Shinmu's body, and the color gradually deepened. It was a red halo. It was the same color as the power of divine fire that Kang Shinmu controlled. This was the power of divine fire's corresponding supreme domain. As expected of you. Mo Ye smiled gently when she saw this. In fact, when Kong Shinmu had been fighting the demon god race elder's puppet, his domain had appeared occasionally around him. Now, Kong Shinmu could finally release a supreme domain on his own. Kong Shinmu's talent was excellent. Kong Shinmu didn't know that there was a red halo around him. His consciousness saw the special nature of this space. On the surface, this was a dusty space filled with sand and soil. It seemed endless. In reality, this was a battlefield littered with skeletons. The battlefield was surrounded by waves of resentment, and it was isolated from the outside world. Waves of red aura drifted out of the skeletons and spread through the space. Gradually, it formed an existence that looked like a dark cloud in the sky. The scarlet aura mixed with the resentment produced by the slaughter on the battlefield and formed a spell similar to a spatial prison. It trapped the cultivators who came and went. The ancient battlefield was gradually filled with the skeletons of new cultivators. On this point, it had the same feeling as the Dragon Demon Cave. Rather than saying that it was a spatial prison spell, it was more like the ancient battlefield had gradually become a kind of domain after a long time. The domain formed by the ancient battlefield contained endless blood, lives, and resentment. It was filled with a cold and eerie feeling. When Kong Shinmu saw the domain in this space, his consciousness was also surrounded by the domain. Jiang Shenwu didn't feel the slightest bit of discomfort when he was in the domain formed by the ancient battlefield. He even felt that as long as he obtained the domain formed by the ancient battlefield, it would be helpful for him to comprehend his supreme domain. Just as Senior Mo Ye had said, the supreme domain was a kind of general concept of power. Kong Shinmu's body was still in the dusty space filled with sand and soil. His consciousness had already collided with the domain in this space. Mo Ye stood next to Kong Shinmu, protecting him. In the ancient battlefield's domain. With a thought from Kong Shinmu, a scarlet halo appeared around his body and gradually spread out in all directions. Wherever it went, the scarlet aura on the bones gradually melted. Within the cold ancient battlefield domain, because of Kong Shinmu's supreme divine flame domain, there was a temperature. Although Kong Shinmu had just comprehended the supreme domain, Kong Shinmu had already comprehended the power of the soul to the 5th level. Such a strong power of the soul far exceeded the scope of the power of the 6th level of the divine flame. At first, releasing the supreme divine flame domain was a little unfamiliar, but as time passed, it became easy. Not long after, Kong Shinmu broke through the ancient battlefield domain. Kong Shinmu suddenly opened his eyes. This time, Kong Shinmu saw the passage to leave this space. It was the direction that the young man in the navy blue robe had left in. Kong Shinmu was terrified. That young man had easily dissolved the ancient battlefield domain and found the exit. His cultivation was at least above the 7th level. Kong Shinmu, not bad. Mo Ye smiled faintly when she saw that Kong Shinmu had comprehended the supreme divine flame domain. Senior Mo Ye, can domains be devoured? Chapter 56:14. Are you talking about the devouring power? Hearing that, Mo Ye frowned slightly and fell into deep thought. Kong Shinmu's devouring power was indeed different from ordinary martial arts. If the devouring power was broken down, strictly speaking, the devouring power was not a martial art. It was more inclined towards the supreme divine power attribute. If it was broken down in detail, it was similar to the supreme domain. The devouring power was also a conceptual power in the domain category. When I was in the ancient battlefield domain, I did a new exploration of the devouring power and found that it could be used more flexibly. Kong Shinmu rubbed his chin and pondered. When I used the supreme divine flame domain to break the ancient battlefield domain, I found that the devouring power could affect it to a certain extent. I guess the devouring power should also be in the domain category. Mo Ye did not agree with Kong Shinmu's analysis, but she did not deny it either. What you need to do now is to stabilize the Supreme Divine Power. You can now use 3 Supreme Divine Powers. During battle, you can use 2 Supreme Divine Powers at the same time, but you have only comprehended 1 Supreme Domain. Moya said gently. Senior, you mean that every Supreme Divine Power has a corresponding Supreme Domain? Kang Shinmu quivered. Didn't that mean that he could still comprehend 2 Supreme Domains now? In time, when he mastered all 7 of the remaining Supreme Divine Powers, he would have 7 corresponding Supreme Domains. That's what happened. Moya smiled helplessly. Originally, every peerless cultivator could only comprehend 1 type of peerless divine power, and then comprehend a corresponding type of peerless domain. But you are an exception. Even now, Moya couldn't help but sigh in admiration at Jiang Shenwu's decisive decision to devour the bloody mist. In addition, Kang Shinmu was extremely talented, so he cultivated the power of divine flame to the peak of the 6th level in a short time. He had also mastered the power of black iron and now comprehended the supreme divine flame domain. Moya was not sure what kind of miracle Kang Shinmu would create in the future. Moya even began to look forward to it. Kang Shinmu naturally understood what Senior Moya meant. Every type of supreme divine power would allow one to comprehend a corresponding supreme domain. It was equivalent to comprehending more supreme divine powers would allow one to comprehend more supreme domains. But Kang Shinmu, there is one thing you need to pay attention to. Moya's beautiful eyes quickly swept over Kang Shinmu's body. She roughly understood the extent of Kang Shinmu's domain of unparalleled divine fire. The supreme domain is different from the supreme divine power. It needs to be controlled by one's soul and consciousness. You must not be anxious. Moya's expression was solemn, and her tone was heavy. Before your soul consciousness is strong enough, don't easily comprehend other supreme domains. Especially the supreme domain that corresponds to the power of the soul. Yes, Senior. When he heard Senior Moya say that every supreme divine power had a corresponding supreme domain, Kang Shinmu also thought of the corresponding supreme domain of the soul power. The power of the soul was closely connected to the consciousness of the soul. If the consciousness of the soul was not strong enough, it was very likely that one would be devoured by the power of the soul. For Kang Shinmu, he obtained the power of the soul through the power of devouring. In that case, the power of the soul was his supreme divine power. It did not matter if he would be devoured by the power of the soul. However, the same could not be said for the supreme domain of soul. The supreme domain of soul was the domain power of the soul power, and it existed as a concept. In essence, it did not belong to Kang Shinmu. If Kang Shinmu wanted to obtain the supreme domain of soul, he needed to comprehend the existence of the supreme domain of soul and then master this power. If the consciousness of the soul was not strong enough, the supreme domain of soul would take over the master. Kang Shinmu knew the stakes and temporarily gave up on mastering the supreme domain of soul. In short, the two of them finally left the space sealed by the domain of ancient battlefield successfully. The surrounding space was no longer filled with sand. It looked no different from the outside world, except that the sky was slightly dark. Kang Shinmu casually raised his head to look at the sky above, then retracted his gaze and glanced ahead. Suddenly, he shuddered, and his entire person became vigilant. Senior Moya, be careful. Kang Shinmu quickly reminded Moya. Moya nodded lightly and also looked at the space around her. Under the dark sky, there were large amounts of dark clouds gathered, making the already dim light even darker. Kang Shinmu noticed that there was his reflection on the ground. The strange thing was that there was no reflection of Senior Moya on the ground. Kang Shinmu's expression was solemn. He moved his feet slightly, and the reflection on the ground moved with him. On the other hand, even if Moya moved with him, there was still no reflection of her. Kang Shinmu, there's something strange here. Moya quickly discovered Kong Shinmu's reflection on the ground. Senior Moya, is this the power of the Supreme Shadow? Kong Shinmu's mind moved, and he instantly identified the strange shadow on the ground. To be able to appear silently around them, it could only be the supreme divine power. Moreover, looking at the concrete appearance, it had a lot to do with the shadow. It's not just the supreme shadow power. Moya sensed for a moment and shook her head gently. There's also the supreme shadow power domain. The moment Kong Shinmu's soul condensed, he sensed the supreme domain. Although it was not obvious, the shadows in this space were most likely the domain power of the supreme shadow power. This was different from the ancient battlefield. There was no resentment of the dead. It was a normal secret realm space, but now, a supreme divine power suddenly appeared. It could only mean that there was a supreme cultivator here, waiting for them to fall into a trap. I originally thought that you would be trapped in the ancient battlefield domain and not be able to come out for a few decades. I didn't expect you to come out now. It's quite surprising. A familiar voice suddenly came from all directions, becoming sharp and ear-piercing. Isn't this the patriarch of the thousand-winged snake clan? What's wrong? You can't beat me outside, so you think you can do it after coming to the secret realm? Although the supreme divine power displayed by the other party was very unfamiliar, the voice and the power fluctuation in the space was the thousand-winged snake clan snake shriek. Kong Shinmu was a little surprised. Before entering the secret realm, he did not sense the existence of Snake Shriek. But he did not expect that Snake Shriek had not only entered the secret realm, but also set up a trap. Moreover, he must have found a helper. However, he did not panic. Now that he had mastered the supreme domain power, it was not difficult to deal with Snake Shriek. It's not up to you to decide whether I can or not. Don't you think so? Snake Shriek laughed sinisterly. His laughter came through the void and condensed in Kong Shinmu's ears. It was like thunder, constantly exploding. So noisy. Kong Shinmu circulated the power of his soul, but he could not resist Snake Shriek's ear-piercing laughter. Chapter 56:15. The sound of a snake's cry came from the void, and the explosion didn't dissipate for a long time. Instead, it gradually condensed and formed a substantial force. Jiang Shenwu looked at the black radiance that was closing in on him. He could feel the power of shadow force from it. However, if he looked closely, he couldn't hear the snake's laughter. When he tried to use his soul power to probe, he heard the snake's laughter again. This laughter came from the domain power. Using the void as a medium, it came through the shadow power. To be precise, it was the supreme shadow power domain. The laughter came from the supreme shadow power domain. Kong Shinmu and Moya were currently in the supreme shadow power domain. No matter what kind of divine power they used, they would be restricted by the supreme shadow power domain and couldn't use their full power. Facing the first wave of Snake's Cry's attack, Kong Shinmu didn't have a good choice. The first thing he thought of was the mysterious iron power. Although he hadn't comprehended the domain power of the mysterious iron power yet, he couldn't break the supreme shadow power domain in a short time. He might as well block Snake's Cry's attack first. Kong Shinmu had always been a decisive person. He didn't hesitate to use the mysterious iron power. In an instant, the black aura formed a shield around Jiang Shenwu's body, blocking the sound attack from Snake Cry and rebounding it back at him twice as fast. It wasn't over yet. Kong Shinmu used all his strength and rushed back to the path of the attack. He opened his mouth and let out a roar. "Come out and fight me head-on." His voice didn't sound loud, and Kong Shinmu didn't think it was a threat. It seemed that his research on soul power wasn't thorough enough. However, this roar stunned Moya, who was not far away. If Moya hadn't used her divine power to protect her body in time, and if Kong Shinmu hadn't attacked her, Moya felt that her ears might have been cut off. This was the first time she heard Kong Shinmu's dragon's cry. If nurtured properly, Kong Shinmu's dragon's roar could become a powerful dragon martial technique. In the future, when he fought with others, he could secretly defeat the cultivator while they were conversing. At the same time, outside the range of the supreme shadow power, Shili first heard his own laughter. Ugh, this laughter, it's so unpleasant. This was the first time Shili heard her own laughter at such a close distance, and she frowned. He was also surprised by Kong Shinmu's methods. It actually reflected his power back to him. Shili was very familiar with her own power, so it was easy for her to neutralize it. But soon, he heard another roar. Come out and fight me head-on. The instant his voice spread out, it forced its way into Snake Mantis's mind and soul. Even though Snake Cry's reaction speed was very fast, Jiang Shenwu's dragon roar still disrupted his mind and consciousness. However, this place was Shili's supreme shadow power domain, so it was easy to deal with Kong Shinmu's dragon's roar. After resisting Shili's first wave of attack, Kong Shinmu retracted his mysterious iron power. He focused his mind, releasing a large amount of his heart-soul power. His powerful heart-soul consciousness instantly spread out, covering the sky and covering the earth. Kong Shinmu's mind flickered, and his heart-soul consciousness followed. In just a few breaths, his heart-soul consciousness covered the supreme shadow power domain. He was sure that this was the supreme shadow power domain created by Shili's supreme shadow power. Moreover, Kong Shinmu also found Shili's traces. Looking at where he was standing, it seemed that he wasn't within the supreme shadow power domain's range. Although he wasn't within the supreme shadow power domain's range, he could still control the supreme shadow power domain as he pleased. Rather than saying that Shili's momentum attack was enhanced by the supreme shadow power domain's power, it was more accurate to say that it borrowed the power of this space. As if to confirm Kong Shinmu's guess, Shili attacked again. Shili's hands quickly formed a complicated seal, and his figure disappeared from his spot. Immediately, Kong Shinmu saw Shili appear in front of him. With the heart-soul consciousness, facing Shili's sudden palm attack, Kong Shinmu didn't panic at all. Instead, he slapped out with a backhand. Clang! Shili felt as if he had hit something hard, causing his hand to tremble in pain. Even his body started to tremble. Is it Ao Tong's puppet? Shili's first thought was that Ao Tong's puppet had returned. Didn't I trap him? Shili was very puzzled. He had trapped Ao Tong's puppet with his own hands. It was impossible for him to escape. How could he suddenly appear? Are you the one who trapped my puppet? Kong Shinmu raised his eyebrows, staring at Shili with an unfriendly gaze. I just can't bear to see the once proud and unyielding demon god tribe elder become your puppet. Shili then realized that the thing he had hit just now wasn't Ao Tong's puppet, but Kong Shinmu's fist. That seemingly ordinary fist contained a strength that was as hard as Ao Tong's puppet. As expected of the power of the supreme mysterious iron power. It does have the taste of the ancient mysterious iron crystal. But it's far from enough. Elder Shili, the strong in this world have compassion for the weak. Him becoming a puppet only means that he's too weak. There's no other meaning. Kong Shinmu casually clenched his fist. The power that erupted from his fist caused the surrounding space to tremble. Shili's expression turned serious, and he smiled sinisterly. Maybe you're right. I should have killed you more decisively and not let you live until now. Elder Shili, you think too highly of yourself. If you could kill me, you wouldn't be here today. Kong Shinmu laughed. Also, you don't have to say anything else. Your outcome will be the same as the demon god tribe elder. As soon as he finished speaking, a bloody aura suddenly surged out from Jiang Shenwu's eyes. His pitch-black eyes seemed to be able to suck away one's soul. In my domain, you are the first person to say such arrogant words. Shili wasn't afraid of Kong Shinmu at all. Shili no longer hesitated. His fists were as dense as raindrops, slapping towards Kang Shinmu one after another. In the beginning, Kang Shinmu used his fists to block. After 3 hits, Kang Shinmu had already retracted his fist. But Shili's fists still couldn't hit Kang Shinmu. Instead, it was as if he had hit a giant rock. Since his attacks were futile, Shili retracted his fists. The next moment, he saw that Jiang Shenwu's body was also surrounded by waves of blood qi. Peerless soul power domain? No. Impossible. The power of the soul was a supreme power that Kang Shinmu had devoured. He might not have the ability to comprehend it, much less the supreme soul domain. Regardless of what the bloody aura surrounding Kang Shinmu was, Shili didn't have time to think. The blood aura that was originally surrounding Jiang Shenwu's body suddenly gathered around him. Furthermore, it even drilled into his body before disappearing. Chapter 56:16. Shili could not find out where the blood qi that entered his body went, but it did not mean that it did not exist. With the strength of his supreme shadow realm, it was impossible for him to be wrong. What did you put in my body just now? Shili looked gloomy and his voice was eerie. The snake's cry soon exploded in the supreme shadow realm. It was like a deafening clap of thunder that pierced through the world. It gradually formed rays of black light that shot towards Kang Shinmu like tens of thousands of swords. At this moment, Jiang Shenwu squinted his eyes and stood in the void, motionless. Shili was not the only one who could not understand what Kang Shinmu was doing. Even Emoya could not guess what he was doing. Emoya's beautiful eyes fell on Kang Shinmu. Shili's tens of thousands of swords pierced through Kang Shinmu's body. The instant the tens of thousands of sharp swords pierced through Jiang Shenwu's body, they all disappeared, and even their auras disappeared. Kang Shinmu was still standing in the same place and did not move at all. The only change was that there was a faint layer of blood qi around him. The appearance of this blood qi gave Shili's supreme shadow power domain a ghostly feeling. The blood qi seemed to have been devoured by the supreme shadow realm, but it did not disappear. Instead, it merged into the realm and was waiting to be unleashed. Shili saw that his tens of thousands of swords had disappeared and Kang Shinmu was not hurt at all. He could not help but be surprised. He knew that Kang Shinmu had the devouring power, but the devouring power could not devour the supreme shadow realm. Just now, the tens of thousands of sharp sword qi rays were condensed from the supreme shadow domain. Just how was it neutralized? It's not something dangerous. You don't have to be so nervous. Kang Shinmu opened his eyes and said slowly. His eyes were red as if they were filled with blood. There was a blood qi flowing in them, which made the smile on his face look extremely eerie. And Kang Shinmu's voice sounded extremely eerie. The person was clearly right in front of him, but his voice sounded distant and distant, giving off a surreal feeling. Buzz. Just as Shili was sizing up Kang Shinmu, he suddenly heard a buzzing sound in his soul consciousness. The voice was extremely weak. If he hadn't been searching for the blood qi, he wouldn't have heard it. Shili was also sure that this extremely weak buzzing sound most likely came from that strange blood qi. He had to take down Kang Shinmu as soon as possible to expel that strange blood qi. Derivation. Shihua murmured in a gloomy voice. Following which, he quickly formed a series of complicated hand seals with both hands. The 10,000 sharp swords that Kang Shinmu had devoured reappeared out of thin air. Under the enhancement of the snake cry derivative spell technique, the power of the tens of thousands of swords increased exponentially. They rushed toward Kang Shinmu in unison. At the same time, Shili used the power of the void. This space quietly changed, it had already changed hundreds of times. Everything happened in less than a breath's time. The power of the void allowed the 10,000 sharp swords to reach Kang Shinmu's body. Facing such a powerful attack, Kang Shinmu finally moved. Ha! Shi Li shouted coldly and began to shrink the Supreme Shadow Domain. In 3 breaths' time, the Supreme Shadow Domain had shrunk to only include him and Kang Shinmu. Moya was excluded from the domain. After fighting a few times, Shi Li more or less understood Kang Shinmu. His strength depended on Moya's help. Shi Li didn't know Moya's background, but his intuition told him that this woman was difficult to deal with. So if he wanted to take down Kang Shinmu in one fell swoop, he couldn't let Moya interfere. Kang Shinmu has twin supreme divine powers, the other is the power of the void. Moya reminded Kang Shinmu before he was expelled by Shi Li's Supreme Shadow Domain. Understood. Kang Shinmu responded. The moment Shi Li's domain attacked, Kang Shinmu already sensed another type of supreme divine power. But he was surprised that Shi Li also had twin supreme divine powers. This might be the reason why Ao Tong couldn't beat Shi Li. But this was also good. The stronger Shi Li was, the stronger his puppet power would be. Facing Shi Li's attack, Kang Shinmu still faced it head-on. Just now, he fused his devouring power into the Supreme Sacred Fire Domain, and it actually devoured the 10,000 sharp swords formed by the Supreme Shadow Domain. Kang Shinmu imitated what he did just now and used the Supreme Sacred Fire Domain to release his devouring power, which completely devoured the 10,000 sharp swords released by Shi Li's Supreme Sacred Fire Domain. It seemed like the devouring power and the Supreme Sacred Fire Domain could work together. The two combined to form a new power that could devour the devouring power of the Supreme Sacred Fire Domain. The devoured Supreme Shadow Domain directly fused with the Supreme Sacred Fire Domain and gradually settled down. Kang Shinmu carefully absorbed this power into his soul consciousness and took the initiative to fight against Shi Li. Shi Li watched as his domain power disappeared for no reason again. He realized that Kang Shinmu might have comprehended the power of a domain, so he decisively sealed his soul consciousness. The power of the void quietly spread out, shredding the space around Kang Shinmu layer by layer. Kang Shinmu's soul power immediately sensed the power of the void. With a leap, he used the holy power Moya released to teleport to the normal space Moya was in, leaving the range of Shi Li's Supreme Shadow Domain. This kid can't have comprehended the power of the soul's domain, right? Shi Li increasingly felt that Kang Shinmu had comprehended the Supreme Soul Domain, and used his final trump card. Fusion of twin supreme divine powers. When a person with twin supreme divine powers reached a certain level, they could fuse into one and produce a portion of the power of rules that they could use. Every supreme cultivator would gradually form the power of a domain when they comprehended more supreme divine powers. After reaching the 10th level of the Supreme Sacred Fire Domain, every time they released a Supreme Sacred Fire Domain, a certain amount of rules would be born. The cultivator would absorb these rules and use them for their own use. This was the power of rules. However, if the cultivator was unable to use these rules for their own use, their soul consciousness would be damaged at best, and they would fall into the cycle of reincarnation forever at worst. Shi Li's shadow power was only at the 8th level. It was far from the 9th level, let alone the peak of the 10th level. He originally thought that with the 8th level of shadow power, the shadow power domain, and the power of the void, he would be able to take down Kang Shinmu. He never would have thought that Kang Shinmu had already comprehended the power of the soul domain. If he wanted to completely defeat Kang Shinmu, he could only use his ultimate move. Shi Li's Supreme Shadow Domain had already comprehended the power of a domain. If he fused it with the power of the void, the rules produced would only be stronger. Rules were determined by one's own Supreme Sacred Fire Domain. Shi Li's rule power was either the shadow rule or the void rule. Chapter 56:17. Kang Shinmu could not see through Shi Li's thoughts. However, Kang Xinmu was very clear about Shi Li's actions. Just a moment ago, Shi Li was still relying on the Supreme Shadow Realm and the power of Void to deal with him. At this moment, Shi Li had retracted the Supreme Shadow Realm without hesitation. There must be a reason for this. Shi Li must have used a big move. After a few exchanges, Kang Xinmu had a general understanding of Shi Li's attacks. In fact, it was just like what Kang Xinmu had mastered. In terms of martial skills, Shi Li was slightly weaker than Kang Xinmu. In terms of supreme divine power, Shi Li did not have the upper hand. Even the Supreme Shadow Force domain was not able to gain any advantage over it. Shi Li silently recited the mantra and had already merged the Supreme Shadow Realm and the power of Void into one. At the same time, Kang Xinmu had also deduced Shi Li's move. Senior Emoya, step back. Although Kang Xinmu knew that Shi Li had merged his twin supreme divine power, Kang Xinmu was not sure what kind of power would be produced after the merger. Would it be a stronger realm power, or the rule power that was higher than the supreme cultivation realm? There was one thing he was sure of. No matter what the situation was, when the Supreme Shadow Realm and the power of Void merged, the power produced would be inseparable from these two. In addition, it was a dual attribute. Kang Xinmu squinted his eyes and operated his own power. As a last resort, he could only forcefully display the Supreme Soul Realm. Kang Xinmu, leave quickly. You are not his opponent. Emoya's gentle voice rang in his ears. Then, Emoya's beautiful figure swept to the side of Kang Xinmu. Senior Emoya, why are you here? Kang Xinmu suddenly opened his eyes. Emoya did not say anything. Her slender hand grabbed Jiang Shenwu's wrist, and she brought him along as she flashed into the distance. Senior Emoya, be careful. Emoya was too anxious and did not notice that there were several black lights flashing in front of her. Kang Xinmu kept knocking away the incoming black lights, protecting Emoya as she moved forward. That person has the power of rules. Emoya's beautiful brows knit together tightly, and her beautiful face was covered in a serious expression. The current you isn't a match for him. The power of rule. Could it be that he has already surpassed Supreme Superior? Hearing this, Jiang Shenwu raised his eyebrows and turned his head to look with interest. It was also at this time that the power of his soul sensed Shi Li's new power. Taking a closer look, Zhang Xian realized that this energy was indeed somewhat similar to the energy he had felt when he was brought into this secret realm. It's not that he has surpassed Supreme Superior. Emoya's fan-like eyelashes fluttered as she glanced behind her. Shi Xi's figure had already disappeared at some point. Even if you're a supreme expert of the 9th level, if you want to step into the 10th level, you'll need to grasp a certain amount of laws. Not to mention stepping into the gate of laws from the 10th level, the gap between them is insurmountable. Emoya's jade hand grabbed Kang Xinmu's wrist and suddenly changed direction. The originally blue sky seemed to be splashed with a layer of ink. It suddenly turned pitch black, and the spirit chi in the air was instantly sucked out. Emoya immediately sensed the abnormality of this pitch-black space. She couldn't fly normally. After a breath's time, this pitch-black space completely lost balance. Emoya and Kang Xinmu fell together. In the process of descending, Jiang Shenwu seemed to hear something ringing in his ears. But when he listened carefully, he couldn't hear anything. Kang Xinmu, use your supreme domain. Emoya's gentle voice contained some anxiety. As soon as she finished speaking, a faint white halo appeared around Emoya's body and surrounded the two of them. Kang Xinmu followed Emoya's instructions and released his supreme divine flame domain. Only then did his falling figure slowly come to a stop. A portion of the white halo that Emoya released entered Kang Xinmu's body. If it was someone else, not only would Kang Xinmu reject that power, but he would also attack the person who approached him. But now, it was Senior Emoya who was injecting power into him. Kang Xinmu didn't reject it. Instead, he accepted this power. The white halo followed Kang Xinmu's power and circulated for a full cycle. Then, it entered Kang Xinmu's soul and consciousness and sank into it. Even when this white halo power entered his soul and consciousness, Kang Xinmu couldn't tell what kind of power it was. The moment the power sank into his soul and consciousness, he felt a familiar feeling. It was just like when he first entered this mystic realm and encountered that mysterious power of laws. Kang Xinmu looked at Moya beside him. Moya's beautiful eyes were tightly shut. Her hands formed a seal, and her body was surrounded by circles of white halo. While Moya was casting the technique, Kang Xinmu didn't stay idle. He held his breath and focused, trying to establish a connection with the power of the soul he had left in Shili's soul and consciousness. 3 breaths later, Kang Xinmu's pupils shrank. The power of the soul told him that Shili was less than 10 feet in front of them. Moreover, just as he sensed Shili's position, Shili's aura appeared next to Senior Moya. "Senior Moya, watch out!" Kang Xinmu exclaimed. He didn't care about etiquette. He grabbed Moya's wrist, which was forming a seal, and pulled her into his embrace. Shili's powerful attack suddenly landed on Kang Xinmu's body. Fortunately, Kang Xinmu had the body of a pitch-black divine dragon. With the strong resistance of the pitch-black dragon scales, he blocked Shili's attack. Even so, Kang Xinmu felt an extremely obscure aura seeping into the pitch-black dragon scales. The invading aura caused Kang Xinmu's internal organs to be dislocated. Kang Xinmu felt a fishy sweetness surge up his throat. Pain gradually spread throughout his body. "Kang Xinmu, are you alright?" Moya abruptly opened her eyes and smelled a faint scent of blood. Her pretty face was instantly filled with a cold expression. "I'm fine. Senior, you have to be careful. This fellow's strength seems to have made a qualitative breakthrough. Even my pitch-black dragon scales can't withstand it." Afraid that Shili would sneak an attack on Moya, Kang Xinmu didn't dare to relax his power of the soul in the slightest when he spoke. As expected, Shili attacked again. His target was still Moya. Kang Xinmu didn't have time to think. He released the 33 stages of his cultivation method, used the Supreme Divine Fire Domain, and concentrated all the power on the pitch-black dragon scales. Bang! Shili's power instantly descended. When the two collided, a loud sound was heard. The pitch-black dragon scales were originally fine. However, the collision and explosion of Kang Xinmu's power and Shili's power on the black dragon scales still impacted the pitch-black dragon scales. The pitch-black dragon scales trembled. There was even a burnt smell. "Kang Xinmu, you're muddle-headed." Moya didn't expect Kang Xinmu to think of such a method to block Shili's power. "Your pitch-black dragon scales can completely block his attack. Using the dragon martial technique will only hurt yourself. The only thing you can't block is the nomological power." Moya's voice was unusually serious. Chapter 56:18. Moreover, I have thick skin. It's not a big deal for me to take some damage. When it came to the black dragon scales, Kang Xinmu was quite confident. Kang Xinmu's confident and sincere eyes made Moya suppress the words that she wanted to say to Kang Xinmu. "I know that your black dragon scales are more resistant to beatings, but they can't withstand the power of the rules." Moya was quite helpless. The power of the rules. Kang Xinmu really did not expect that Shili would produce the power of the rules after fusing with his Supreme Twin Divine Powers. It was not difficult to deal with the Supreme Twin Divine Powers. Even if it was against the Supreme Shadow Force Domain, it could be broken. Once this matter was related to the power of the rules, it was hard to say. The biggest problem Kang Xinmu was facing now was not whether he could beat Shili, but that his power might not work against Shili's power of the rules. Moreover, after fusing with the two supreme divine powers, all of Shi Li's power had greatly increased. The aura formed by the supreme shadow force just now was obviously stronger than before. Kang Xinmu has already fused the two supreme divine powers, so he can no longer control the supreme shadow force and the supreme void force. At this time, he is releasing a brand new power, the power of the rules. Moya carefully analyzed Shi Li's power. Based on the nature he has shown so far, it should only be the shadow attribute. Senior Moya, you mean that the power he is using now is all the power of the rules? Kang Xinmu fell into deep thought. If Shi Li's current power was all the power of the rules, then did it not mean that his black dragon scales could withstand most of the power of the rules? In principle, he is using the power of the rules, Moya said gently. Moya also felt the power that attacked Kang Xinmu's black dragon scales just now. That power was only on the surface, but it was indeed the power of the rules. Although the black dragon scales were very strong, they could not withstand the power of the rules. But just now, Jiang Shenwu's pitch-black dragon scales had blocked the majority of the snake cry's power. A power that could be blocked by the black dragon scales definitely couldn't be the power of rules. The small amount of power that had invaded Kang Xinmu's body was the true power of the rules. Shi Li was the elder of the thousand-winged serpent race and was one of the top unparalleled experts. In addition, he had the twin-life unparalleled godly power. Not only had the supreme shadow force reached the 8th level, but it had also grasped the power of a domain. Coupled with the equally powerful void force, the fusion of these two powers would definitely produce a powerful rule force. However, the actual strength of Snake Shriek's rule power was lower than the strength in principle. This was enough to prove that the Snake Shriek's rule power had two natures. If it had only condensed into one type of rule force, its strength was definitely not something that the current Kang Xinmu could withstand. There must have been a deviation in the process of fusing the two powers, resulting in the formation of two types of rule force. Moya said softly. The formation of two types of rule force also made his power heterogeneous. Although it can't be compared to pure rule force, it's still stronger than pure supreme divine power. At this point, Moya emphasized, of course, your pitch-black dragon scales can withstand these impure powers. Senior Moya, can you understand it this way? Any power that is blocked by my black dragon scales is a heterogeneous power that is lower than rule force and stronger than supreme divine power. What can't be blocked is pure rule force. Kang Xinmu seriously thought about Moya's words and came to a conclusion. It's like this. Moya was indeed a little surprised by Kang Xinmu's understanding, but for now, this was the only way for him to distinguish the rule force. Kang Xinmu sized up the power that had invaded his body. There were a total of two abnormal powers, both of which were contained in his soul consciousness. Generally speaking, it was very dangerous to lock an external power into one's soul consciousness. It was very likely that one would be devoured and lose oneself. However, this explanation did not make sense to Kang Xinmu. Kang Xinmu's soul power locked Shi Li's rule force into his soul consciousness. At the same time, his soul power surrounded these rule forces, so Shi Li's rule force could not invade. Shi Li himself also sensed that his rule force had entered Kang Xinmu's soul consciousness. He controlled his rule force in an attempt to control Kang Xinmu's soul consciousness and occupy control of Kang Xinmu's body. However, this process was much more difficult than he had imagined. Kang Xinmu's soul consciousness was as unfathomable as the vast ocean, causing Shi Li to be confused for a moment. Kang Xinmu had noticed Shi Li's thoughts long ago. He tried his best to control his soul power to prevent Shi Li's rule force from invading. Kang Xinmu was different from ordinary cultivators who had just stepped into the supreme level. When he broke through to the Supreme God Peak, he devoured 9 types of supreme divine powers. Although he could only quickly master one of them in the end, the power contained in the other 8 types of supreme divine powers was a great supplement for his soul consciousness. In addition to the power of the Holy Land and the soul power that he devoured later, Kang Shinmu's soul consciousness increased to the equivalent of an 8th-level supreme divine power, or even stronger. How could such a terrifying soul consciousness be invaded by Shili's rule force? Just as Kang Shinmu was controlling Shili's rule force and planning to refine and devour it, the Shifang Devil Extreme Seal suddenly opened on its own. It absorbed Shili's 2 types of rule force. The dark appearance of the Shifang Devil Extreme Seal immediately had a luster. Kang Shinmu could clearly feel the power above the Shifang Devil Extreme Seal constantly increasing. The 9-layer seal suddenly opened, and the strength of the power that was emitted from it far exceeded the strength of just now. The most direct change of the Shifang Devil Extreme Seal after absorbing Shili's rule force was the seal on its body. Last time when Kang Shinmu fought with Qi Han and Qi Yen of the Emperor Bat clan, he directly opened the 9-layer seal of the Shifang Devil Extreme Seal and defeated Qi Han and Qi Yen with the power of a heaven and earth saint grade. Now that the Shifang Devil Extreme Seal had absorbed Shili's rule force, it actually opened the 10th-layer seal. Kang Shinmu saw the process of the 10th-layer seal opening with his own eyes. Suddenly, a series of complex runes flashed around the 10-directional Devil Extreme Seal with 9 layers of seals activated. Kang Shinmu counted a total of 89 types of runes. After the 89 types of runes appeared, they were imprinted around the Shifang Devil Extreme Seal and then disappeared. The Shifang Devil Extreme Seal returned to its original state. After a breath of time, the Shifang Devil Extreme Seal lit up. A series of complicated and incomprehensible runes flashed out from the inside of the Shifang Devil Extreme Seal and condensed on the seal. This was the first time Jiang Shenwu had seen such a change in the 10-directional Devil Extreme Seal. However, as he understood the state of the 9 layers of the 10-directional Devil Extreme Seal, he immediately recognized that this was the 10th layer of the 10-directional Devil Extreme Seal. Chapter 56:19. After Shili's power of rule was absorbed by the Great Demon Seal, not only did it recover the energy it had lost, but it also opened the 10th layer of the Great Demon Seal. To Kang Shinmu, this was undoubtedly an opportunity. Since this power of rule could be absorbed by the Great Demon Seal, then the rest of Shili's power of rule could also be absorbed by the Great Demon Seal, right? Kang Shinmu suddenly had a bold idea. Through the power of rule that invaded Kang Shinmu's soul consciousness, Shili could feel how strong Kang Shinmu's soul consciousness was. Since the power of rule that invaded Kang Shinmu's soul consciousness couldn't be completely controlled, then he would try again. Shili's mind flickered as he released the power of rule of shadow and the power of void, attacking Kang Shinmu together. Kang Shinmu used the pitch-black dragon scales to block Shili's attack. However, this time, he didn't use the dragon martial technique or the supreme divine power. He simply used the dragon scales to block Shili's attack. When the two collided, a large portion of the power was blocked by the dragon scales. An extremely small portion of the power penetrated the dragon scales and invaded Kang Shinmu's body, heading straight for Kang Shinmu's soul consciousness and sea of consciousness. It was the power of rule of shadow and the power of void. Before Kang Shinmu's soul consciousness could block the two power of rule, the Great Demon Seal absorbed them all. The speed was so fast that Kang Shinmu couldn't help but click his tongue. Wasn't the Great Demon Seal absorbing too fast? Shili knew that Kang Shinmu wasn't easy to deal with, so he didn't hold back and attacked Kang Shinmu with all his strength. He was sure that Kang Shinmu couldn't use the dragon martial technique or the supreme divine power to block his attack, so he used all the power in his body. After the supreme shadow power and the supreme divine power of void merged, not all of the power condensed into power of rule. Most of the power existed in the form of rules. To put it simply, these rules were stronger than supreme divine power, but they were far inferior to the power of rules. It could be considered the waste energy produced during the fusion. If Kang Shinmu mastered the power of the rule, then these rules would be useless against Kang Xinmu. Regrettably, Kang Xinmu was just a supreme cultivator. Although he had devoured the power of the Holy Land and the power of the soul, it was still someone else's power. It was not Kang Xinmu's own supreme divine power, so he could not achieve the goal of fusion. These rules were more than enough to deal with Kang Xinmu. Kang Xinmu's pitch-black dragon scales could resist the rules, but he couldn't attack, or he would be devoured by his own power. Shili used this point to forcefully force back Jiang Xinwu's pitch-black dragon scales using the rules. Without his black dragon scales, Kang Xinmu was like a lamb waiting to be slaughtered. "Kid, where's your courage just now?" Shili laughed sinisterly. He condensed the power of void rules and split the void around Kang Xinmu into several pieces. It also separated Emoya and Kang Xinmu. His senses told him that Emoya was extremely strange. He could not let her spoil his plan. How long ago was this? "You are the thousand-winged snake tribe's elder, why are you so petty?" Kang Xinmu glanced at Shili and stopped thinking. He was now focused on the extreme 10 Devil Seal. Kang Xinmu originally thought that the 10th level of the extreme 10 Devil Seal would be the same as the previous 9 levels, which would be a holy item that could transform itself into attacking power. He did not expect that the 10th level of the seal would actually strengthen the power of the extreme 10 Devil Seal holder. Just now, Kang Xinmu's pitch-black dragon scales were damaged by Shili's consecutive attacks. When the 10th level of the extreme 10 Devil Seal was activated, it gradually repaired the damaged pitch-black dragon scales. Not only that, Kang Xinmu clearly felt that his soul consciousness and sea of consciousness had expanded again. The power of rules of Shili that invaded his soul consciousness and sea of consciousness just now seemed extremely insignificant. Kang Xinmu wanted to explore what kind of power the 10th level of the extreme 10 Devil Seal brought him, but he was shocked to find that the 10th level of the extreme 10 Devil Seal had suddenly closed. Not only did the 10th level of the seal close, but the extreme 10 Devil Seal itself had also closed. Looking at the dim extreme 10 Devil Seal, Kang Xinmu was a little speechless. They had not fought yet, but why did it seem like they had just experienced a fierce battle? He could not understand it. In the next moment, when he glanced at the surrounding space, his pupils suddenly shrank. Kang Xinmu was shocked. His eyes saw the void being split into countless pieces. Emoya, who was clearly next to him, seemed to be thousands of miles away in this broken void, so far that he could not touch her. Kang Xinmu extended his hand to Emoya. "Kang Xinmu, don't." He heard Emoya's ethereal voice. Her voice was still gentle, but it had an unusual sense of anxiety. Kang Xinmu hurriedly retracted his hand, but he still accidentally touched the void pieces beside him. It was as if he had touched a sharp knife, which cut the back of his hand. An intense pain followed. Kang Xinmu looked at the wound on the back of his hand, which was emitting black gas. To be precise, it was the shadow, which was the rules of shadow. "Kid, don't try to talk too fast." Shili naturally would not be distracted by a few words from Kang Xinmu. He glanced at the wound on the back of Kang Xinmu's hand, and the smile on his face became even more ferocious. Kang Xinmu furrowed his brows. He clearly saw that there were countless black lines surrounding Shili's body. The twisting black lines intertwined with each other in a complicated manner in the void that had been split into countless pieces, forming a prison that trapped Kang Xinmu within. Kang Xinmu was not sure if the pitch-black dragon scale could break out, but his eyes could see how terrifying these complicated black lines were. The pitch-black lines flashed with black gas, which was the same as the black gas emitted from the back of his hand. The power contained within was not something that his pitch-black dragon scale could resist. Kang Xinmu squinted his eyes, but he saw that everything was normal in the space. Could the scene that he just saw be an illusion? Just as he thought of this, a blood-red light flashed in his mind. Although it was very fast, Kang Shinmu could still see the words on it. It was the rune on the 10th level of the extreme 10-directional devil seal. At the same time, Kang Shinmu felt a cold energy drilling into his eyes. He saw the pitch-black space that had been split by countless black lines. It was not an illusion. The scene in front of him was Shi Li's void rules, and those black lines were the rules of shadow. The reason why he could see it with the naked eye was because of the power of the 10th level of the extreme 10-directional devil seal. The 10th level of the seal did not close, but instead fused into his eyes. He could see the void rules and the rules of shadow. How could he deal with it? Kang Shinmu looked at the wound on the back of his hand. The black gas suddenly disappeared, and the wound quickly healed. Chapter 56:20. Hiss! The sharp pain in his eyes made Kang Shinmu suck in a breath of cold air. He couldn't see what was happening to his eyes. He could only feel the pain. He could only close his eyes tightly. Shi Li sensed Kang Shinmu's abnormality and took the chance to get close to Kang Shinmu. Countless black lines that divided space instantly covered Kang Shinmu's body. Shi Li's hand gestures kept changing. The black lines formed by the shadow rule suddenly shrank. Although the pain in Kang Shinmu's eyes hadn't disappeared, Kang Shinmu's soul consciousness was still very sensitive. He could still sense the shadow rule's attack around him. This was the pure shadow rule. It didn't contain any other attacks. Kang Shinmu naturally didn't use the black dragon scales. He gathered his soul consciousness and trapped it in his sea of consciousness. This was the only way Kang Shinmu could resist the power of the rule at the moment. You don't really think that your supreme soul domain can resist the power of the rule, do you? Shi Li saw Kang Shinmu's eyes closed. His body was full of blood energy. He grinned. Shi Li's laughter echoed in the void around Kang Shinmu. When it entered Kang Shinmu's ears, it became a powerful attack that attacked Kang Shinmu's soul consciousness and sea of consciousness. Kang Shinmu frowned. Shi Li, this old guy, was harder to deal with than he had imagined. He knew how to use the void rule well. Kang Shinmu was trapped in the space separated by Shi Li's void rule. He couldn't move as he pleased. Moreover, the shadow rule's attack was closing in. Kang Shinmu was in a dilemma. While Kang Shinmu was thinking of a countermeasure, the shadow rule's black lines had already descended. A moment ago, it was 10 feet away. In the blink of an eye, it was close to Kang Shinmu. Jiang Shenwu instinctively released his pitch-black dragon scales. However, he saw the shadow rule directly penetrate the pitch-black dragon scales. Kang Shinmu suddenly opened his eyes and watched as the power of the rule of shadow wrapped around his body, burrowed into his flesh, and fused with his soul, consciousness, and sea of consciousness. The stinging sensation in his eyes was still there, but Kang Shinmu could still clearly see every movement of the law of shadow. It could even be seen that the black lines were actually formed by the condensation of shadows. Kang Shinmu narrowed his eyes and finally found the source of those shadows. Only then did he remember a detail. After the snake cry merged the supreme void power and the supreme shadow power, it formed two types of nomological powers. When he used the power of the law just now, he first used the void law to cut the space into pieces. Then, he used the rule of shadow. These were the black lines that were currently being displayed. The black lines were actually the reflection of the void after it was cut. The reflection was summoned by Snake Cry's shadow law and condensed into black lines. In other words, Snake Cry had only mastered the power of the void law. To use the rule of shadow, one had to rely on the void law to release it. Kang Shinmu finally found a breakthrough point. Just as he was about to use the power of the soul to summon the supreme 10-directional demon seal, he was shocked to find that the supreme 10-directional demon seal had no reaction at all. No matter how hard Kang Shinmu tried to summon the supreme 10-directional demon seal, the supreme 10-directional demon seal did not respond. Without the supreme 10-directional demon seal, even if he found a breakthrough point, it would be very difficult to deal with the power of the law. Now that things had come to this, Kang Shinmu decided to go all out and try to understand the supreme soul domain. Snake Cry's rule of shadow had completely invaded Kang Shinmu's soul, consciousness, and sea of consciousness. Kang Shinmu condensed the power of the soul and approached the rule of shadow. The rule of shadow, as its name suggested, could change the rules of all shadows. Snake Cry was trying to use this to control Kang Shinmu. But after a while, Snake Cry's expression changed. What is this? There was actually no shadow in Kang Shinmu's soul, consciousness, and sea of consciousness. Snake Cry was extremely shocked. Kang Shinmu had a supreme soul domain, so how could there be no shadow? Any domain with supreme power was a shadow. Even the supreme soul domain had a shadow. But now, Snake Cry really could not find any shadow in Kang Shinmu's soul, consciousness, and sea of consciousness. Could it be that Kang Shinmu had not comprehended the supreme soul domain? Snake Cry's expression was frosty. He had overestimated Kang Shinmu. Originally, he wanted to use the supreme soul domain to control Kang Shinmu's soul, consciousness, and sea of consciousness. But from the looks of it, he could only destroy Kang Shinmu's soul, consciousness, and sea of consciousness. Suddenly, as Snake Cry's rule of shadow advanced, he found the dark side of Kang Shinmu's soul, consciousness, and sea of consciousness. It was impossible for such a huge soul, consciousness, and sea of consciousness to not have shadows. Snake Cry took the chance to enter. Kang Shinmu, be careful. Don't create any shadows. Just as Kang Shinmu was about to use the supreme domain, he suddenly heard Emoya's gentle voice. This voice seemed to ring out directly in his mind. Kang Shinmu searched for the source of the voice. Due to the interference of the void's laws, he could not see Emoya's figure. Instead, he saw a white halo penetrating the space that had been split apart and gradually condensing beside him. Looking closely, he could see that these white halos were formed by extremely small dots of light. Was this Senior Emoya's power? Now that things had come to this, Jiang Shenwu already understood that his eyes could see the rules. In the past, when he saw Senior Emoya's power, it was a white halo, which was in the form of a cloud of mist. But now, he saw a halo formed by white dots of light. Did this also mean that Senior Emoya's power was the power of laws? However, now was not the time to think about this. He should think about how to deal with Snake Cry. Senior Emoya's white dots of light condensed around Kang Shinmu's body. Kang Shinmu saw these tiny dots of light enter his body and condense in his soul, consciousness, and sea of consciousness, illuminating his entire sea of consciousness. As a result, there was no darkness in his sea of consciousness, which meant that there was no shadow. Senior Emoya's power was very fast. It arrived one step ahead of Snake Cry's rule of shadow. After eliminating the shadow in Kang Shinmu's soul, consciousness, and sea of consciousness, Snake Cry's rule of shadow could be considered to have lost its offensive power. After Senior Emoya's reminder, Kang Shinmu came to a sudden realization. If he did not create a shadow, Snake Cry's rule of shadow's attack would be greatly weakened. Moreover, his rule of shadow needed to be created with the help of the void's laws. As long as he destroyed the void's laws, then the rule of shadow that had invaded his soul, consciousness, and sea of consciousness would completely disappear. Kang Shinmu, remember, do not use your domain. Emoya's gentle voice sounded again. Woman in the way. Snake Cry also heard Emoya's voice. His face sank as he grabbed in Emoya's direction. How dare you? Kang Shinmu did not care about anything. His figure suddenly moved forward and blocked in front of Snake Cry. Chapter 56-21. Jiang Shenwu watched with his own eyes as his body was penetrated by the shadow rule. His internal organs felt like they were about to be torn apart. Jiang Shenwu froze on the spot. His mind was extremely clear at this moment. "Senior Moya, dodge!" Kang Shinmu shouted instinctively. Moya saw Kang Shinmu's actions and pursed her lips. She wanted to say something but stopped herself. In her eyes, the distance between her and Kang Shinmu wasn't far. The reason why they seemed so far apart was because of Shi Li's void rule's influence. Kang Shinmu was worried about Moya, and Moya was also worried about Kang Shinmu. Seeing that he didn't care about his own safety and wanted to block Shi Li's attack, she felt an indescribable mix of emotions. Shi Li's shadow rule hadn't formed yet and couldn't attack two people at the same time. Kang Shinmu, attack his body, Moya frowned and said gently. When Moya's gentle voice entered his ears, Kang Shinmu suddenly came back to his senses. After his body was penetrated by the shadow rule, there didn't seem to be any problems. However, Kang Shinmu didn't look for Shi Li's body immediately. Instead, he flew towards Moya's position. The shadow rule hadn't attacked him, which meant that the shadow rule had locked onto Senior Moya. He couldn't let the shadow rule hurt Moya. Bam! Before he could even move a few steps, Jiang Shenwu crashed into the void that had been split apart. When he looked over, the void in front of him was divided in an irregular manner. Even though his eyes were enhanced by the 10th level of the extreme 10-directional devil seal, he couldn't see Moya's figure. With the void rule blocking him, Kang Shinmu couldn't get close to Moya for a while. Even if he couldn't fly over with his body, he could at least use his strength. Kang Shinmu controlled his supreme divine power and surrounded Shi Li's shadow rule. The shadow rule penetrated his strength directly, but its speed was obviously slowed down. Kang Shinmu didn't hesitate to release his devouring power while the shadow law slowed down. The strange thing was that as soon as Kang Shinmu released his devouring power, the devouring power disappeared. Soon after, the black lines that surrounded the void also disappeared. After a few breaths of time, this space was no longer dark and gloomy. It was filled with brightness. Even so, Kang Shinmu could still see that the void, which had regained its clarity, was filled with broken cracks. The shadow rule disappeared, and the crack in the void suddenly moved quickly. Kang Shinmu had almost figured out the rule force of Snake Cry. He had indeed fused two types of rule force, but he couldn't use both at the same time. Moreover, the law of shadow had to be produced by the law of void, and it could only control shadows, not create shadows. Since the shadow rule had disappeared, only the void rule was left. It didn't matter which rule force was left. As long as there was only one rule force, it wouldn't be able to hurt Moya. Let alone that it was just the void rule. Relying on the 10th level of the extreme 10-directional devil seal's engraving, Kang Shinmu could see any changes in the void rule clearly. After ensuring that the void rule couldn't hurt Senior Moya, Kang Shinmu calmed his mind and took the initiative to attack. "The two of you are quite affectionate, huh?" Snake's dark eyes glanced at Kang Shinmu, who was trapped by the void rule, and then at Moya, who was not far away, and said coldly. The sound of Snake Cry reverberated in this void rule. Kang Shinmu couldn't determine his exact location for a moment. Kang Shinmu gathered his soul consciousness and searched for the location of Snake Cry. Suddenly, he discovered that his devouring power appeared again. It was just that the devouring power was concentrated in his eyes. With the devouring power, the pain in his eyes also disappeared. Kang Shinmu blinked a few times and saw the current situation of the shattered void in front of him clearly. The void wasn't really shattered. Instead, it was folded. To be more precise, Snake Cry had used the void rule to rearrange the space that Kang Shinmu was in. By redividing a small space, it formed the current folded space. From a spatial perspective, this space had become bigger. Actually, the size of this space hadn't changed at all. Then the space that Snake Cry could move in was also within this space. Even so, it was still very difficult for Kang Shinmu to find Snake Cry's real body within Snake Cry's void rule. What did you say? Speak louder, I can't hear you, Kang Shinmu thought for a moment as he listened to Snake Cry's echoing in his ears. Kid! Don't be too arrogant. Snake Cry didn't expect that Kang Shinmu would still dare to talk so big when he was trapped by his void rule. As soon as he finished speaking, Kang Shinmu found his figure. It's here. Kang Shinmu narrowed his eyes. He suddenly turned his body sideways and threw a punch to his right. Any shattered void that was touched by his fist would be devoured. The fist landed squarely on Snake Cry's face. Not only did Snake Cry not expect this attack, but even Kang Shinmu was stunned for a moment. Being able to find Snake Cry didn't mean that his attack had any effect on him. However, from the looks of it, his attack had indeed hurt Snake Cry. As the fist landed, Snake Cry's face turned purplish-blue. Then, he spat out a mouthful of blood. You, Snake Cry's eyes stared at Kang Shinmu, how did you find me? He couldn't believe it. Kang Shinmu had never come into contact with the power of rule. How did he break his rule? First, he broke the shadow rule, and now he broke the void rule? Is this the price you have to pay for merging two supreme divine powers? Kang Shinmu glanced at Snake Cry. His current state looked terrible. He wasn't as strong as before, and his whole body was full of flaws. It's enough to deal with you. Shi Li said coldly. He silently chanted a spell, and a black curtain fell from the sky, surrounding Jiang Shenwu's entire body. Hey, are you dying? Kang Shinmu looked at his half-arm strangely. He didn't understand. Was it because his arm was too long, or was Snake Cry's shadow rule not working? I will cut off your dragon scales now. Snake Cry's voice was cold. As soon as he said that, Kang Shinmu felt a stinging pain coming from his black dragon scales. It was as if there was a sharp blade cutting his black dragon scales. Kang Shinmu's mind moved, and the pain in his eyes attacked him again. At the same time, he saw the half-arm outside the black curtain. The space around the arm was twisting. That was Snake Cry's void rule. When the void rule was cutting his black dragon scales, the shadow rule was in a binding state. It only restricted Kang Shinmu's movement and didn't have any effect. Devour. Jiang Shenwu growled in a low voice. The devour power condensed in his eyes suddenly swept out, wrapping the shadow rule around him and rapidly shrinking. Not long after, the shadow rule was completely devoured. The devour power returned to his eyes. Kang Shinmu suddenly realized that there was an unfamiliar power in his eyes. Chapter 56-22. Kang Shinmu felt the additional shadow law in his eyes. He tried to operate it and found that he could actually control this force. At this moment, Shi Li's heart was filled with horror. His shadow law was actually swallowed by Kang Shinmu. How could Kang Shinmu's devouring force even devour rule power? The next moment, Shi Li caught a glimpse of Kang Shinmu's eyes. That pair of dark and deep eyes had waves of blood energy surging, forming a complex rune. A cold light flashed in his eyes. Black energy surged and gradually condensed on that rune. Then, the black energy was absorbed by the rune. After the rune absorbed the black energy, it went silent in Kang Shinmu's eyes. A mark appeared in Kang Shinmu's eyes. Shi Li's pupils shrank as he watched. The black energy absorbed by the rune was his shadow law. At this moment, Shi Li clearly felt that he had lost contact with the shadow law that he released. No matter how he tried to control the shadow law, there was no reaction. Generally speaking, rule power couldn't be absorbed. Not to mention that rule power would become a part of Kong Shinmu. What was that rune in Kong Shinmu's eyes? Why could it absorb rule power? The more Shili looked, the more surprised he became, especially when he saw the mark in Kong Shinmu's eyes. There was a rune's shadow. 7 Devouring Demon Sealing Art. That rune was the chant of the 7 Devouring Demon Sealing Art. The 7 Devouring Demon Sealing Art was a technique that truly existed in the legends. Almost every supreme cultivator who reached the 9th level and started to comprehend rule power would come in contact with the rumors of the 7 Devouring Demon Sealing Art. It could also be said that the 7 Devouring Demon Sealing Art was a door to step into the world of rule power. However, this door was rarely opened by anyone. It wasn't an exaggeration to say that ever since the birth of supreme power, no one had ever stepped into it. The 7 Devouring Demon Sealing Art, as its name suggested, was a sealing technique that had the ability to devour. The 7 Devouring Demon Sealing Art had a total of 7 realms, but it was impossible to advance through cultivation. One could only advance through refining different nomological powers. Through devouring rule force, the cultivation art would be able to advance, thereby enhancing the cultivator's own rule force. It could be said that the 7 Devouring Demon Sealing Art was a heaven-defying art. It was precisely because of its heaven-defying existence that it attracted many plunderers ever since it was created. In the process of fighting, the 7 Devouring Devil Sealing Art became tattered and scattered across various planes. Shili was an elder of the 1,000-winged serpent race. He had seen many things and had long heard of the 7 Devouring Devil Sealing Art. However, the versions that circulated back then were all different. Most of them said that the 7 Devouring Demon Sealing Art could only advance by devouring supreme divine power that was stronger than the cultivator's own divine power. Every supreme cultivator would comprehend their own supreme divine power according to their own innate talent. To supreme cultivators, supreme divine power was the core of cultivation. If his core was weaker than another cultivator's core, how could he devour the other's core? Therefore, this rumor was quickly suppressed. However, the rumors about the 7 Devouring Demon Sealing Art did not stop. On the contrary, every once in a while, there would be a new rumor. The most recent rumor was several hundred years ago. It was around the same time as the Dragon Demon Cave's appearance. There were rumors that the 7 Devouring Demon Sealing Art would appear because of the rules. Therefore, most cultivators guessed that the 7 Devouring Demon Sealing Art's cultivation art might be related to the power of rules. Many cultivators who had comprehended the power of rules also began to move quietly. This secret realm was a space that could move. The essence of space movement was determined by its rules. It was said that it was a secret realm created by the first wielder of the 7 Devouring Demon Sealing Art. Its name was Feng. As for what happened to the first wielder of the 7 Devouring Demon Sealing Art after obtaining it, no one knew. In fact, very few people had even heard of Feng. Shili had once inadvertently entered a mysterious space and read about the theory of seal. According to the words in that mysterious space, Feng's mastery of the 7 Devouring Demon Sealing Art had reached 90%. In short, up until now, any talk about the 7 Devouring Demon Sealing Art was only a rumor. After Feng, it was likely that no one had ever obtained the 7 Devouring Demon Sealing Art. Shili had come into contact with the power of rules, and believed in the existence of the 7 Devouring Demon Sealing Art more than any other supreme cultivator. Moreover, he had been searching for traces of the 7 Devouring Demon Sealing Art for so many years. Back then, when he, the demon god race, the talisman race, and the other large races had chased Kong Shinmu's traces, Shili had already discovered the existence of this secret realm. From then on, he had played a game of chess. He wanted to use Kong Shinmu to find traces of the 7 Devouring Demon Sealing Art, and then take him down in one fell swoop. But what he did not expect was that Kong Shinmu had actually been trapped by the ancient battlefield domain. What surprised him even more was that Kang Xinmu had broken through the ancient battlefield domain. A half-baked supreme cultivator who had just stepped into the supreme stage, and was not even sure of his own supreme power, could actually break through a supreme domain? Shi Li was even more certain that the treasure that Kang Xinmu possessed was most likely related to the 7 devouring demon sealing art. If he had obtained Kang Xinmu's treasure, finding the 7 devouring demon sealing art would be a piece of cake. Now that he had fought with Kang Xinmu, Shi Li was pleasantly surprised. He did not expect that Kang Xinmu actually possessed the 7 devouring demon sealing art. Kang Xinmu did not know what Shi Li was thinking. He only felt that there was something extra in his eyes. Moreover, the 10th level of the extreme 10-directional devil seal seemed to have fused into his eyes. Even though the extreme 10-directional devil seal had not been activated, the 10th level of the seal was still in his eyes. In other words, the 10th level of the seal could be separated from the main body of the extreme 10-directional devil seal. After obtaining the 10th level of the seal, his devouring power could directly devour the power of rules. Kang Xinmu desperately wanted to know if the extra thing in his eyes was the shadow rule that had been devoured. Since this power had been devoured, could it still be used by him? With this thought in mind, Kang Xinmu tried to establish a connection with the shadow rule that had been devoured. He controlled the shadow rule to restrain Shi Li. Shi Li was shocked. This brat, Kang Xinmu, had really devoured his shadow rule and was now under his control. Break. After all, it was his own rule power. Shi Li did not believe that Kang Xinmu could control the shadow rule with his elementary supreme stage cultivation. Restrain. Kang Xinmu immediately shouted. The shadow rule turned into black ropes that wrapped tightly around Snake Cry. Then, it quickly tightened. The smell of blood permeated the air. Chapter 56-23. There was no mistaking it. This rune was the 7 devouring demon sealing art. Regardless of how Kang Xinmu obtained the 7 devouring demon sealing art, he only had one choice: kill Kang Xinmu and seize the 7 devouring demon sealing art. If there was any mistake, the result might be the other way around. Shi Li spat out mouthfuls of blood and quickly changed the seals in his hands. Kacha. The space around him shattered inch by inch. Glass-like fragments turned into sharp swords that headed straight for Kang Xinmu. Kang Xinmu reacted quickly and nimbly to avoid Shi Li's attack. Even so, there were still several swords that pierced his body. Shi Li's attack just now was formed by the space law. Logically speaking, the black dragon scales shouldn't have been able to block the space law. But the truth was that the black dragon scales had blocked most of the attack. This also meant that Shi Li's mastery of the void law wasn't as good as the shadow law. The 10th layer of the extreme 10-directional devil seal entered Kang Xinmu's eyes and hid within them. At first, Kang Xinmu thought that the 10th layer of the extreme 10-directional devil seal had entered his eyes temporarily. Only when the seal in his eyes changed the devouring power and absorbed Shi Li's shadow law did Kang Xinmu realize that the seal in his eyes wasn't simple. Or rather, from the very beginning, the 10th layer of the extreme 10-directional devil seal already had some clues. The seal in his eyes had changed the devouring power a little and absorbed the shadow law. After absorbing the shadow rule, engraving also advanced and reached the first level. Through the seal's advancement, Kang Xinmu understood the true identity of the seal in his eyes. It was called the 7 devouring demon sealing art. It was a technique he had never heard of before. Whether the 7 devouring demon sealing art was powerful or not, it was Kang Xinmu's first time coming into contact with it. But he noticed that the 7 devouring demon sealing art relied on devouring power to advance. Relying on devouring other power to advance was enough to prove the power of the 7 devouring demon sealing art. After devouring Shi Li's shadow law, the 7 devouring demon sealing art had successfully advanced to the first layer. However, he had barely entered the first level. This also meant that Shi Yi's rule force was only half-baked. Kang Xinmu clicked his tongue. Shi Li saw Kang Xinmu's reaction and couldn't help but frown when she saw that Kang Xinmu wasn't knocked down by her Void Law attack. Kang Xinmu, don't think that you can do it just because you've resisted some rules. As Shi Li spoke, his figure had already approached Kang Xinmu. In less than a breath's time, he had given Kang Xinmu hundreds of palm strikes. Every move was imbued with the laws of the void, and with every palm strike, the space around Kang Xinmu was sliced apart. By the time Shi Li retracted his palm, Kang Xinmu had already lost his range of movement. No matter how he stood just now, the space around him had been cut into a certain shape. Return. Shi Li did not intend to drag this any further, and he immediately contracted the void laws. An extremely strong sense of spatial pressure suddenly attacked. Kang Xinmu only felt that the air in the space had disappeared completely, and a deep sense of suffocation arose spontaneously. I'll return those words to you. Kang Xinmu's eyes sank. The engraving in his eyes suddenly lit up. At the same time, the devouring power swept out in all directions. Not only did it wrap around the void laws around him, but it also penetrated through the layers of the void laws. Even the folded space was surrounded and then swallowed. After absorbing the shadow law, the 7 devouring demon sealing art seal had barely reached the first level. It was easy for him to absorb Shi Li's half-baked void laws. In less than 3 breaths' time, the 7 devouring demon sealing art seal had completely absorbed the void laws released by Shi Li, kid. Seeing this scene, Shi Li's face was terrifyingly ferocious. He gritted his teeth as if he wanted to tear Kang Xinmu into pieces. First, Kang Xinmu had blocked the twin supreme god power, then the shadow law was absorbed, and now even the void law was absorbed. He could only use one of the void laws with his remaining power. There was no shadow in this space, and he could only condense the void laws. This was his last attack, and he could only succeed. Shi Li released his soul consciousness and controlled the 1,000-winged snake clan's bloodline inheritance, merging it with his heart meridian. A 30-feet-long blood-red python appeared behind him, but it soon disappeared in mid-air. At the same time, Kang Xinmu felt his heart tighten. He tried his best to circulate his bloodline power and lock his heart meridian. An extremely obscure power was blocked. Perhaps it was due to Kang Xinmu's powerful impact, but the obscure power revealed its true face. It was the 3-zhang-long giant blood python that Kang Xinmu had seen a moment ago. Even though it was blocked outside his heart meridian, the giant blood python did not retreat. Instead, it opened its bloody mouth, flicked its tongue, and bit over. Kang Xinmu frowned as he used all his strength to block the giant blood python's biting attack. He had underestimated Shi Li's methods. He couldn't win on the surface, so he started to use this kind of mental attack. The giant blood python was not Shi Li's last resort. It was just a prelude. Shi Li's real move was still the void laws. He turned his remaining power of laws into the void laws, and released it with Kang Xinmu as the target. The giant blood python could be said to be Shi Li's last resort. He used the giant blood python to open the space in Kang Xinmu's bloodline, and then used the power of the void laws to a greater extent. Every cultivator would create a shadow wherever they were. However, Kang Xinmu's shadow had been broken by that annoying woman. This caused Kang Xinmu's surroundings, and even his body, to not have any shadow. This caused the shadow laws to be unable to attack him, which was why they were absorbed by the 7 devouring demon sealing art. However, the space that Kang Xinmu had set up himself would exist at all times. As long as he stood there, a certain space would be formed. Any space could be controlled by the void laws. The giant blood python invaded Kang Xinmu's body and lingered outside his heart meridian, biting at the heart meridian that Kang Xinmu had protected. This way, Kong Shinmu had no time to care about anything else, and it was the best time to take him down in one fell swoop. Shi Li used the void laws and released several blood pythons from Kong Shinmu's body. They rushed into Kong Shinmu's mind and consciousness. When the blood pythons reached his mind and consciousness, most of Kong Shinmu's power was still gathered around his heart meridian. Kong Shinmu, I want to see what other tricks you have. Shi Li sneered. The blood pythons that invaded Kong Shinmu's mind and consciousness suddenly self-exploded, turning into streams of blood mist that merged into his mind and consciousness. Chapter 56-24. Young man, you have to be down-to-earth in your cultivation and cultivate step by step. Don't try to use some unorthodox methods, and don't rely on your tongue. Shi Li raised his brows when he heard that. He didn't take Kong Shinmu's words to heart. Indeed, there was no need for him to care about someone who was about to die. As he spoke, several blood pythons suddenly gathered around Kong Shinmu. I'll accept your advice, but I'll return what's yours. Kong Shinmu said indifferently. Shi Li's void law was indeed powerful. It could actually invade his body without him noticing. Of course, the blood pythons that invaded his consciousness were not the void law, but Shi Li's thousand-winged snake race bloodline power. The laws of the void acted as a medium to bring this power into his soul, consciousness, and sea of consciousness. The sudden self-destruction caused Kong Shinmu to break out in cold sweat. Fortunately, all the power of the blood python's self-destruction was within the detection range of his soul. The devouring power that merged with the 7 devouring demon sealing art instantly surged into his consciousness and devoured the thousand-winged snake race bloodline power. After devouring, the 7 devouring demon sealing art was still at the first level. Its strength was not even as strong as the shadow law. Kong Shinmu understood that the 7 devouring demon sealing art had turned into 8 fragments. He had obtained this fragment because it was one of them. It was also the only inscription of the 7 devouring demon sealing art. Currently, this inscription was only at the first level. Kong Shinmu couldn't determine what the inscription was. He could only determine that it was an ancient language that he had never come into contact with before. Most likely, he would only be able to see the inscription's true appearance after reaching the 7th level. Coincidentally, this inscription was also of the devouring attribute. The 7 devouring demon sealing art could deal with the inscription of the 7 devouring demon sealing art. Shi Li's void law was completely devoured by the 7 devouring demon sealing art, including the thousand-winged snake race bloodline power. The 7 devouring demon sealing art absorbed the laws of the void and automatically excluded the bloodline power of the thousand-winged snake race. Kong Shinmu possessed the bloodline power of the Dragon God clan. Although the bloodline power of the thousand-winged snake clan was not bad, it was somewhat unnecessary for Kong Shinmu. However, before Kong Shinmu could refine the thousand-winged snake clan's bloodline power, he felt the extreme 10 directions devil seal suddenly activate and absorb the thousand-winged snake clan's bloodline power. After absorbing the power of the thousand-winged snake race's bloodline, the extreme 10-directional devil seal's body was covered in blood runes. The extreme 10-directional devil seal's 9 layers were activated. Supreme 10-directional devil seal. When Shi Li noticed the extreme 10-directional devil seal in Kong Shinmu's hand, his eyes turned gloomy and scary. He was also wondering where Kong Shinmu, an ant who had just stepped into the supreme level, had gotten the 7 devouring devil sealing art from. So it was obtained through the 10-directional devil seal. After activating the 9 layers of the extreme 10 directions devil seal, its power was enough to deal with Shi Li. Kong Shinmu controlled the extreme 10 directions devil seal. The 9 layers of the seal released 9 streaks of dark red energy that rushed towards Shi Li. Shi Li, who had mastered the void law, could control the battlefield as long as there was space around him. Shi Li controlled the void law and changed the path of his attack. That wasn't the end. Shi Li aimed at Kong Shinmu. He planned the path again and directed the power of the extreme 10 directions Devil Seal to attack Kong Shinmu. Kong Shinmu had already expected that Shi Li would do that. He activated the 7 devouring devil sealing art in an attempt to devour the power. At that moment, Kong Shinmu sensed that the 7 devouring devil sealing art had released the void law. It rapidly folded the space and allowed the extreme 10 directions devil seal's attack to hit Shi Li directly. The entire process took less than a breath of time. Even Kong Shinmu couldn't react in time, let alone Shi Li. Until he was hit by the 9 layers of the extreme 10 directions devil seal, Shi Li still couldn't understand how Kong Shinmu was able to control this power. Kong Shinmu followed up with another attack. He used the 7 devouring devil sealing art to devour the remaining void law of Shi Li. Shi Li had lost the power of the 1,000-winged snake race's bloodline and rule power. Now, he was like an arrow at the end of its flight. Especially when he saw that not only had Kong Shinmu absorbed his rule power, but he was also able to use it. His mind and consciousness were in chaos. He couldn't withstand Kong Shinmu's fatal attack. Shi Li was defeated. Jiang Shunwu had originally planned to turn Shi Li into a puppet as well. However, Shi Li was an unparalleled cultivator who had fused 2 types of unparalleled divine powers to produce the power of rules. It was an act that defied the natural order. Not only did he lose to Kong Shinmu, but he was also punished by the rule power. After the void law was removed, the space returned to normal. Shi Li's corpse fell vertically. Just as it was about to touch the ground, it suddenly exploded. It turned into a shadow and seeped into the ground. What's going on? Kong Shinmu instinctively rushed to Moya. He was afraid that Moya would be affected by Shi Li's counterattack. This is the punishment he deserves. Moya's beautiful eyes glanced at the ground that had recovered to its original state as she spoke indifferently. Punishment? Is it because he merged the rule power? Kong Shinmu frowned. Moya said gently. He is a supreme cultivator with twin divine powers. If he were to cultivate according to the rules, it would only be a matter of time before he comprehended the rule power. However, he has forcefully merged the rule power. This is equivalent to violating the rules. Everything in the world must abide by the rules. Only then can the worlds operate normally and all living beings survive. Even though there is a competitive relationship between all living beings, this is also an inevitability of the world's operation. The 1,000-winged snake clan's elder violated the rules of the rule power and was punished. Cultivation is about progressing step by step. If you want to reach the sky in one step, it will inevitably be accompanied by all kinds of hidden dangers. I can't ruin my cultivation journey for the sake of a momentary benefit. Moya suddenly paused. Her beautiful eyes fell on Kong Shinmu. She saw that Kong Shinmu's eyes were drifting and he looked absent-minded. He seemed to be thinking about something. She raised her voice. Kong Shinmu, you must remember this too. Senior Moya, you must have seen it too. The rule power I obtained was absorbed by my cultivation technique. It has nothing to do with me. Kong Shinmu spread his hands innocently. Got it. Moya nodded helplessly. She was not afraid that Kong Shinmu would touch the rule power. She was just worried that Kong Shinmu's devouring of the rule power would backfire on him. After all, Jiang Shunwu was only a supreme cultivator now. Although he had relied on the devouring power to raise his supreme divine power to level 6, a level 6 supreme divine power did not have the ability to touch the rules. After the 7 devouring demon sealing technique devoured Shi Li's void rule power, Kong Shinmu also had the void rule power. Just now, Kong Shinmu sensed many unfamiliar auras rapidly approaching. Kong Shinmu, let's go. Chapter 56-25 2 hours later, Kang Xinmu and Emoya came to an ancient city. The closer they got to the ancient city, the more cultivators they saw. As far as they were concerned, the cultivators they saw were all above the supreme realm. There were even some cultivators whose cultivation base Kang Xinmu couldn't see through just by looking at them. However, Kang Xinmu had the 7 devouring demon sealing arts mark in his eyes. With a thought, he activated the 7 devouring demon sealing art, and he could clearly see the cultivation base of the cultivators who passed by. After sizing them up, Kang Xinmu felt a little pain in his eyes. He squinted his eyes, and only then did he feel that the pain wasn't that intense. Kang Xinmu, you haven't stabilized the power of the mark. Don't casually activate the mark. Emoya approached Kang Xinmu, and her beautiful eyes stared at Kang Xinmu's eyes without blinking. This is the mark of the 7 devouring demon sealing art. Looking at its current form, it should be at the first stage. You haven't comprehended the power of the rule, so don't casually activate the mark. Emoya gently reminded him. Senior Emoya, do you also know about the 7 devouring demon sealing art? Kang Xinmu controlled the mark of the 7 devouring demon sealing art and looked at Emoya. As the mark of the 7 devouring demon sealing art closed, the pain in Kang Xinmu's eyes gradually disappeared. Emoya's pretty face froze when she heard this. She frowned as if she was thinking about something. It's okay if Senior Emoya doesn't know about it. Kang Xinmu teased, Junior will slowly explore it. Pfft, Emoya was amused by Kang Xinmu's words. It's not that I don't know about it. It's just that it's a little hard to express. Emoya pondered for a while before saying, what I can be sure of is that all the information about the 7 devouring demon sealing art in the world is from the fragments of the 7 devouring demon sealing art. Even the fragment of the 7 devouring demon sealing art is only a rumor among many supreme cultivators. Until now, no cultivator has actually seen the fragment of the 7 devouring demon sealing art. As she spoke up to hear, Emoya's beautiful eyes descended onto Kang Xinmu, and she smiled. You can be considered the first. It seems to exist in the 10th layer of the extreme 10-directional devil seal. Kang Xinmu did not hide anything from Emoya. However, after the 7 devouring demon sealing art devoured the power of laws of the 1,000-winged serpent clan's clan elder, I discovered that there is a difference between the 7 devouring demon sealing art and the 10th layer of the extreme 10 devil seal. The 10th layer of the seal is still within the extreme 10-directional demon seal. The seal that entered my eyes is the seal of the 7 devouring demon sealing art. Yes, the engraving that entered your eyes is the only engraving of the 7 devouring demon sealing art. After reaching the 7th layer, the engraving will be perfected and you will be able to sense the location of the other fragments, Emoya said gently. Senior Emoya, what does the only mark look like? After the 7 devouring demon sealing art devoured Shi Li's 2 types of laws, it reached the 1st layer. Kang Xinmu clearly felt that there was something extra in his eyes. It was most likely the only engraving of the 7 devouring demon sealing art. However, he was curious as to whether his eyes were still normal. Here. Emoya agreed to every request. With a wave of her slender jade-like hand, a bronze mirror appeared in her hand. She aimed it at Kang Xinmu's eyes. There doesn't seem to be anything. Kang Xinmu flipped his eyelids, but he couldn't find anything extra. His eyes were still his original eyes, and he couldn't find anything strange. The mark of the 7 devouring demon sealing art will only appear when you use the 7 devouring demon sealing art. Emoya gently smiled. Seeing that Kang Xinmu was about to release the 7 devouring demon sealing art seal, she hurriedly stopped him. Don't use it unless you have no other choice. In your current state, you absolutely cannot expose the existence of the 7 devouring demon sealing art seal. Emoya pondered for a moment before speaking. If I'm not wrong, most of the cultivators who came to this secret realm are here for the 7 devouring demon sealing art. In other words, the 1,000-winged snake clan's elder knew about the existence of this secret realm from the start. Kong Shinmu rubbed his chin as he thought about everything that had happened. Ever since the Demon God Clan, Talisman Water Clan, 1,000-winged Snake Clan, and many other clans chased after him, this 1,000-winged Snake Clan's elder had been playing a game of chess. Yes, and I can confirm that there are fragments of the 7 devouring demon sealing art in this secret realm, Mo Yet said gently. In Jiang Shenwu's mind, the image of the young man in the navy blue robe he saw before entering the secret territory suddenly appeared. That young man must have come for the 7 devouring demon sealing art. Moreover, his cultivation level must be above the Supreme Being level. Kong Shinmu frowned as he felt conflicted. They had entered this secret realm purely because they were brought in by the secret realm. They didn't know about the secret realm at the start. Now that they knew there were clues about the 7 devouring demon sealing art, should they go and fight for it? If he could get the fragments of the 7 devouring demon sealing art, he would have 2 fragments of the 7 devouring demon sealing art. It would only be the icing on the cake for his cultivation. Kong Shinmu, we don't know where the secret realm's exit is now. We can explore it first, Mo Yet said gently. Yes, Senior, Kong Shinmu was enlightened. His idea just now was too extreme. He didn't have to get the 7 devouring demon sealing art. He could also explore the location of the 7 devouring demon sealing art first. The two of them arrived at the entrance of the ancient wilderness ancient city. However, he discovered that there were many people gathered at the entrance of the city. All of them seemed to be discussing something, and all of them had grave expressions. These people were dressed differently. From the way they stood, they seemed to belong to different forces. When Kong Shinmu and Mo Yet arrived, the crowd first glanced at them. Then, they tacitly took a few steps back, creating a passage that led to the ancient wilderness ancient city. The crowd gave way to Kong Shinmu and Mo Yet and stood quietly at the side. They didn't say anything else. This unusual action was really strange. Kong Shinmu subconsciously took a step forward, standing in front of Mo Yet on the left. He was ready to deal with any unexpected situation. Behind him, more and more cultivators started to gather. They were all in groups. There were even some familiar auras. Kong Shinmu. Let's see where you can run this time. A sinister voice sounded, followed by a chilling sword chi. However, when the sword energy approached Kong Shinmu, it suddenly disappeared. Kong Shinmu frowned slightly and turned to look at the person who attacked. The person was wearing the clothes of the Demon God clan. He held a long sword in his hand, but it was already sheathed. A pair of gloomy eyes stared at Kong Shinmu, but he didn't say anything. He stood at the side, as if he was waiting for something. Behind him was a large troop of the Demon God clan. All of them stared at Kong Shinmu with gloomy faces. Even the clansmen of the Fu Shui clan, who followed behind, were the same. Kong Shinmu retracted his gaze and looked at the ancient wilderness ancient city in front of him again. Chapter 56-26. Of course, Jiang Shenwu was puzzled no matter how he racked his brains. Why would these cultivators open up a path for him and Mo Yet? Jiang Shenwu looked at Mo Yet, who was at the side, and coincidentally met Mo Yet's gaze. Her beautiful eyes were filled with a gentle smile, dispelling the doubts in Kong Shinmu's heart. After the crowd opened up a path, they no longer paid attention to Kong Shinmu and Mo Yet. The Demon God race and Talisman Aqua race that had rushed over had their eyes fixed on Kong Shinmu. These two teams were not the ones that had chased after Kong Shinmu previously. Instead, they had come for this mystic realm. However, on the way here, they had learned of what Kong Shinmu had done. All of them wished they could tear Kong Shinmu apart. To the Demon God race, their elder Ao Tong had been refined into a heart-devouring blood centipede by Kong Shinmu. He had lost his conscience and dignity. Even after his death, he would not have a good ending. They could not let this matter rest. They must make Kong Shinmu pay the price. This time, the person who came was Ao Tong's sworn brother, O-E. Ao Yi's eyes had never left Kong Shinmu. His gloomy eyes caused the surrounding air to become heavy. Beside Ao-E was Ao Yi's protector, Ao Feng. He was the only one from the demon god race holding a long sword. The sword aura that attacked Kong Shinmu just now was also from him. Ao Feng was confident that he could defeat Kong Shinmu with the power of his supreme sacred sword. However, the sword aura just now had mysteriously disappeared. Even though Ao Feng had only used 30% of his sword technique, it had mysteriously disappeared. This made Ao Feng unhappy. Ao Feng held the hilt of his sword tightly. The powerful sword aura hit the scabbard, causing it to buzz. "There's no hurry." Ao-E glanced at Ao Feng and said calmly. They were determined to capture Kong Shinmu, but now that the city lord of the ancient desolate city was about to appear, they could only look for another opportunity. Although he had heard of the rumors about the ancient desolate city lord, he was able to easily erase Ao Feng's sword chi, so he was definitely not an ordinary person. In the eyes of the Fu Shui clan, Shui Qinghan wasn't a match for Kong Shinmu because her skills were inferior. The leader of the Fu Shui tribe, Shui Mo, stared at the extreme 10-directional devil seal on Kong Shinmu's body. The extreme 10-directional demon seal was a sacred item of the world. Obtaining the extreme 10-directional demon seal would not be a problem at all. Compared to the demon god clan's hatred for Kong Shinmu, Shui Mo was more interested in the treasures on Kong Shinmu. Regardless of the attitudes of both sides towards Kong Shinmu, based on the current situation, both sides and everyone present had to wait quietly outside the city. The ancient desolate city was the core of this mystic realm. Long before the mystic realm appeared, there were rumors that there was an ancient city in this mystic realm named Sealed, and the ancient city contained all the clues to the 7 devouring demon seal art. A portion of the cultivators that came to this mystic realm had a clear goal, which was to head straight for the ancient desolate city the moment they entered the mystic realm. The first batch of cultivators that rushed to the ancient desolate city had already been waiting outside the city for a few days. During this period of time, they could be considered to have a clear understanding of the ancient desolate city. It was a city that covered an area of less than 100 feet, and there was only one city gate. The city gate had been opened long before they arrived, and it had been open until now. The city walls of the ancient desolate city were different from ordinary city walls. They were flat and uneven, and there were even many places that were broken. The scenery within the ancient desolate city could be seen through the city walls or the city gates. It seemed to be a bustling and peaceful atmosphere. It was indeed hard to imagine that an ancient desolate city that existed in the sealed mystic realm for an unknown period of time actually had living creatures. The people who were busy inside the ancient desolate city were not much different from the people outside the city. They seemed to be unaware of the crowd gathered outside the city, and no one looked at the city gate. For a few days, the sky outside the city remained clear and bright. On the other hand, the inside of the city was obviously only a door away from the outside, but the day and night alternated, which was very strange. It was worth noting that in these few days, the things that happened in the city were surprisingly consistent. It was as if everyone in the city was repeating the same thing. During this period, there were cultivators who tried to enter the city, but the strange thing was that the moment they stepped through the city gate, the ancient desolate city disappeared, and only a desert area could be seen in front of them. If they wanted to cross the city walls of the ancient desolate city would also disappear. It was precisely because of the strange things in the city that many cultivators stopped. There was also a portion of cultivators who came later. They did not know much about the ancient desolate city. Seeing that the surrounding cultivators were waiting on the side, they did not act rashly and quietly waited on the side. As time passed, the number of cultivators gathered outside the ancient desolate city increased, and the atmosphere became noisy. Until the arrival of Kang Xinmu and Emoya broke the noisy atmosphere of the crowd of cultivators. Kang Xinmu and Emoya had also just arrived at the ancient desolate city, and they still had many doubts about this ancient city. Roughly glancing at the situation around, Kang Xinmu was stunned. Many of the cultivators gathered at the gate of the ancient desolate city actually had a grudge against him. When he looked at the crowd, everyone was also staring at him. The moment the two sides' eyes met, there were bursts of sparks. When each of them saw Kang Xinmu, their eyes instantly turned cold, and they hated that they could not use their eyes to kill Kang Xinmu. Their faces constantly changed ferociously, and it was even more of a show. However, Kang Xinmu did not intend to pay attention to them at all, and he quickly retracted his gaze. Before they were clear about the situation in this city, they would not take any action. The passage that the crowd made was still there, causing many cultivators who had a grudge against Kang Xinmu to feel an inexplicable fear of Kang Xinmu. The ancient desolate city was so strange, and all the cultivators who came here were all above the supreme realm. What's more, their supreme divine power had already reached the 8th level. Even such experts could not enter the ancient desolate city, but they made a passage for Kang Xinmu? Kang Xinmu and Emoya did not have time to guess what the crowd was thinking. Both of their eyes were focused on the bustling scene in the city. Through the city gate, they could see the streets of the city. There were people coming and going, and occasionally, there were patrolling troops. Kang Xinmu could not help but frown deeply. What was going on? Senior Emoya, there are actually living people living in this ancient city? Kang Xinmu was very puzzled. Looking at the style of the troops, it looks like that. Senior Emoya frowned slightly and said after a moment of consideration. Which senior? Kang Xinmu was surprised. A general named Leng Changhong. Although Emoya's tone was gentle, there was still some doubt on her pretty face. This name made Kang Xinmu's heart sink. Senior Emoya, do you remember that we passed by an abandoned castle before we came to this ancient city? Kang Xinmu's expression was solemn. Yes, Emoya replied softly.